This is a first draft of history, and we're trying to capture what happened here for generations to come. I want to thank our moderators, Dan Balls of the Washington Post, Catherine Miller of BuzzFeed, and Andrea Mitchell of MSNBC and NBC for joining us today, and invite them to just kick this session off.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Nico. And I want to thank everyone for inviting us and for being here and for teeing this up so provocatively. We are here to help create the first draft of history with the primary sources, and we are grateful to both campaigns for being here in the spirit of reconciliation and of an academic exercise here, as well as addressing the fact that this was such a predictable campaign and all of us in the media got everything so correctly forecasted that there may not be enough to discuss. But given what we've just heard, I wanted to take off from there. Everyone is going to we really want you to respond to what we've just heard from Nate Silver, from all of the others earlier today. Our mission, as Nico has said, is the first draft of history, and we're thinking about a number of themes to pick up on. Dan Balls, why don't you start off as we address the general election with some of the biggest themes for both sides to talk about.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. We know this is likely to be a lively and at some moments difficult session. We are eager to get as candid responses from both sides as we possibly can. We know there are tough moments that we're going to go through. Just to give you a sense of how we want to try to do it, we want to use the first major chunk of this to kind of go through a timeline, starting in probably the end of May and going forward and hitting some of the highlights and as we get toward the end of the campaign, drilling down deeper, because that's still one of the great unknowns, I think, from all sides as to exactly what happened in the last weeks. We will take a break at some point. Once we finish most of that, we will come back and try to pick up on some thematic aspects that perhaps didn't get fully aired out in that discussion. And then we want to leave time for questions, not just from some of the students, and I want to thank publicly Sharon Yang, Archie Hall, and Nick Bonstow for the great work they did in helping us get prepared for this. But we want to open it up. We want to save some time for questions from anybody in the audience who by the end of 2.5 hours may still have some unanswered questions or feel that there are things that we've left on the table that need to start. I want to start with a general question for each side, and let's start with the Trump side since you won the campaign. As the general election was taking shape, what did you see as the biggest vulnerability of your candidate, the biggest obstacle to being able to win a general election? And then we'll get the Clinton campaign to answer that about Secretary Clinton. Kellyanne?
Thank you very much, Dan, and everyone else. Thanks for having us here. The greatest obstacle probably in winning was the fact that Mr. Trump had to take his message consistently and daily directly to the voters to try to cut through the noise or the silence, depending on what the case was. So voters are constantly being told, this is important to you. Please stare at it. Please listen to breaking news for 5 days about it, which by definition means it's no longer breaking news. And that was a little bit of a hurdle because there was an open question of would voters turn their attention away from what they tell pollsters, including all of your pollsters, what's important to them, jobs, everyday affordability, fairness, immigration, healthcare, education, and the like, national security certainly, turn their attention away from that to go and chase the latest rabbit down a given hole. And the voters did not do that. But that is a challenge because sometimes if you're looking at an avalanche of sameness, you start to wonder, wow, are people giving folks what they're asking for? Are people actually requesting? Are they somehow saying, I want to hear more about X, Y, and Z and not the fundamentals that have always undergirded the issue set in this particular campaign and frankly most presidential campaigns? They weren't that different. And it was that really was more than having a much smaller team, much smaller staff, and more than having a much smaller budget than Team Clinton. I would say that was a challenge.
Well, let me ask you about
I can add to that. I think that the additional challenge was also corporate.
Also, as we start around,
Brad
say your
Parscale
name
with
so
the Trump
that
campaign.
the book people will have it.
I also think we had corporate bias against social media platforms and other types of entities that had a liberal bias to them, so they didn't want us to work within their environments. We had a lot less cash, as that's obvious. So for buying media and doing things, and on top of that, we had media bias that we had to then spend energy and money out of that to then advertise and push to tell the correct message. So not only did we have to promote our campaign, we had to spend the time to fight media bias and corporate bias.
Neither of you has mentioned a couple of things which would seem obvious to me and some others. One was the degree to which Trump had created headwinds for himself with things he had said all through the course of the campaign, and you had 55 or 60% of the voters saying they did not think he was qualified to be president. Was that, or was that not a concern? And if not, why not? And second, you had coming out of the primaries a very fractured party. I mean, this was not a consolidated Republican Party. You had the likes of, Mitt Romney as sort of the biggest symbol of that, but very many Republicans who had not bought into the Trump campaign. How much at the outset was that a concern?
Sure. Dan, with respect to the number of people who either had an unfavorable view of Donald Trump or asked separately in polling questions, thought he was, quote, not qualified to be president, it almost became the correct answer more than true voter opinion, because they were told, here is what's important to you. So I don't remember a lot of polling questions about temperament, for example, in past campaigns, maybe one or two when John McCain was the nominee. But by and large, a lot of the public polling was even oriented toward what the larger storylines were. And then so you have polling questions to make the storylines inform the polling questions. And meanwhile, a lot of people in the country were looking past that. Sorry?
So you discounted the significance of that.
Didn't discount it. We just knew that there were other things flooding the zone for the electorate. So, for example, veracity and truthfulness ended up being a presidential qualification for a lot of people in the country. For most of the electorate, the 70% or so number that said they wanted to take the country in a new and different direction never budged. And Tony Fabrizio and the whole polling team, there were 5 polling firms involved, including his and mine, we saw early on, we really focused very heavily, state by state, in this 23 to 28% of the electorate in each of those states that said, A, they want to take the country in a new and different direction, but they weren't yet voting for Donald Trump. And they weren't necessarily, the one thing that the undecided voters were very decided on was that they did not want to vote for Hillary Clinton. They already knew a lot about her. But, ethics and veracity and truthfulness, those were qualifications too. And I think they were hiding in plain sight, and it mattered. You had asked a question also about, in terms of Donald Trump, were we worried about him stepping on his message, et cetera? I think one thing that was missed all along in this election is something that we noticed early on, which is there's a difference to voters between what offends you and what affects you. And they were being told constantly, stare at this, care about this, make this the deal breaker once and for all. And they were told that 5 or 6 times a week about different things. And yet they voted the way voters have always voted, on things that affect them, not just things that offend them.
Can we switch now to the Clinton side and you all respond to the issue of, Robbie, when Phil and I were doing the oral history, one of the things you said was there were clear headwinds. You knew there were headwinds, but could you talk about that both in terms of the environment and also then the issues for her as a candidate?
Look, I agree. I think Kellyanne sort of hit on a key question in this race, which was voters overwhelmingly wanted change. And we saw that. I think anybody looking at the race saw that. And obviously that did create some headwinds for Hillary. By 2 to 1 or more, people wanted a fundamental change in direction. That was at odds sometimes with actually pretty decent favorability for President Obama, but they were looking for a different direction. What we also saw, however, was that by almost the same margin, people thought the kind of change that Donald Trump represented was too much of a risk. And that's so that was the change was the headwind we saw. We thought the risk was a solution. to that headwind. I think we, in that regard, underestimated how much of a headwind that would be. So that was the risk that we saw, or rather the headwind that we saw and the one we tried to deal with. I think there were two headwinds we could never see until they happened. And the first was the unprecedented intervention by Russian intelligence when they stole emails from the DNC and from John Podesta and selectively leaked those over the course of the entire general election. And did so in a very strategic way. No one of those emails that was put out there, one day of that, was a game changer in the race. However, it was a low-grade fever throughout that was an enormous strategic disadvantage. And then secondly, and I thought Nate's assessment of this was accurate, two singular events that were incredibly impactful were those two letters from James Comey. So if you ask me what is the single greatest headwind we faced on the race, it was the two letters by James Comey. And one made the other worse. You know, you could argue that the first one depressed our support, certainly stripped away a lot of those particularly those, you know, Nate was exactly right in his assessment of the electorate in terms of the big chasm that opened between college-educated and non-college-educated. I would argue that first letter had the effect of stripping away a lot of the college-educated support that President Obama had not had and some of the non-college-educated support that he had. I would argue then the second letter inflamed some of those voters in Mr. Trump's base. So again, there was the one we perceived, which again I think we underestimated the force of that wind of change. But I thought Nate's assessment by the numbers that Comey's letters in fact probably were a game changer was correct.
We will get in more detail into the Comey letter and what happened in those last 10 days. Andrew, you said you wanted to do a follow-up.
I just wanted to follow up. We do want to drill down on the Comey issue and that aspect of the emails being resurrected at that point in the campaign. But Kellyanne touched on something when she said that, you know, people really respond to what affects them, not what offends them. And in the broader context of what some might say was a vacuum of an economic message that affected them every day, do you think at that point that was what was missing?
I think
to reach those voters in a more personal way.
Yeah, look, I'm glad you asked the question because I think it's been out there. But I have a slightly different interpretation. Others here should weigh in. If you look at the exit polls in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, those core sort of Rust Belt states that everybody talks about, for voters for whom the economy was their number one issue, Hillary actually won those voters. Hillary Clinton went on a tour of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio after the convention to talk about jobs. Hillary spoke out on Mr. Trump's use of Chinese steel. So the economy was part of the message. Among people for whom the economy is important, we did win that cohort. I think, look, if I could go back, would I have spent more time in those Midwestern states? Would we have talked about those issues more? Absolutely. So that I'm not pushing back on that altogether. But I do think what was at play here was a broad mandate for change versus a specific economic argument. I don't think the voters were looking at that narrowly. I think this was a much bigger desire to completely change the system.
And I think as we proceed, I want to drill down on that. I was on the bus tour and went on the bus tour for one reason. I wanted to compare it to 1992, which I covered. And there were some dramatic differences. So I want to ask you about scheduling and about battleground state visits as we proceed, because there's a question of how much retail politicking actually took place in those white working class areas. But the other question was how you framed that message in the entire general election, not just the closing weeks. But I want to pass it to Catherine for one of the more broader thematic questions.
There we go. Okay, so let's so we can get into the timeline. Let's keep this fairly brief and jazzy here. And as a reminder, by the way, while we're doing this, only 2 mics can be on at a time. So please turn your mic off when it's finished speaking. So a question, we'll go Clinton and then Trump, same question, but basically what, at the beginning, so May, June, looking at the map, what was the top weakness, what was the top strength looking at the other from your perspective, what was Trump? And that's, let's start there.
Well, I think, and then others on the team should weigh in here too. Again, to go back to Nate, I thought something we talked about often on the campaign, I know with some of you, was that the story of the campaign, in our view, was the story of Maine's 2nd Congressional District and Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. Depending on where the race was, and I think Kellyanne hit on this, the race was very fluid. I mean, even within a matter of days, it was incredibly fluid, particularly as we saw at the end. But a consistent trend was the more non-college educated or the more college educated really varied the result. And in particular, what we saw, and look, this is why we were looking at states like Michigan and Wisconsin, was that those were the states, those proportionally non-college educated whiter states were the ones that moved more, were more elastic in the contest. So when we were looking at the strategy, for example, a lot of people don't know, we actually had 200 staff on the ground in Michigan. We had 180 staff on the ground in Wisconsin. We actually, across 13 battleground states, fully staffed them up from a ground game perspective because that's a resource that you cannot put in at the last minute. In retrospect, should we have put even more in terms of schedule or perhaps some paid communications into Michigan and Wisconsin? Absolutely. But I assume the Trump campaign would probably agree with this. It really was, we were stronger in places like the Washington, D.C. media market or the Denver media market, where they were proportionally more college educated. It was, Pennsylvania, we believed, was more of a vulnerability for us than for President Obama because of that dynamic.
Sure. Specifically, though, with Trump, like what was Trump's strength from your perspective? What was his weakness?
Well, it was Iowa, Ohio. Those were.
Okay.
Are you meaning from a character standpoint?
I'm
sorry. I thought you meant demographic.
Well, it was interesting, so
it's
fine.
Okay.
But yeah,
I'm glad I filled that in. Look, others here should weigh in. I will just touch back. In an election cycle where voters wanted fundamental change, Donald Trump sure was a fundamental change from the kind of leadership that we had. Again, our argument was that change posed a tremendous risk to our security, to people's economic future, to the values that we believe have made our country great. But sure, I mean, it was a strength to be an outsider, and others should weigh in.
I would also just say, just from a media perspective, it's something I think our Republican colleagues from the primary were talking about. There is just a fundamental challenge when you are about to give a policy speech on the economy and on MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News is an empty podium waiting for Donald Trump to come and speak. Or the latest tweet changes what we're talking about on a given day. So, and I know that's thematically something that's been raised and we may talk about more, but I think the nature of the coverage, I think, was also a factor in terms of a strength, because you knew he was going to get the airtime, whether it was good or bad, he would get it. And breaking, even for Hillary Clinton, breaking into that at times was a challenge.
But I mean, that was something that was clear by the time you got into a general election against him.
Well,
that was a reality.
The question was, what was our...
So
the question was, what challenges do we think we faced in May and June? And the two big challenges I thought we faced were he gets all the coverage, and you guys only covered her when she was talking about him. And Andrea, go back and look at your coverage of our bus tour. See what you covered. I remember, it was about, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something that you wanted us to react to from their side. And our concern was how are we going to break through in a way that was independent of our opponent? And also, was Trump going to move to the center and become a different kind of candidate? That didn't happen. But the former problem was a problem to Election Day.
Thanks.
Joel wants
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You asked about both sides also. So, I mean, I think we all agree about the dynamic of change in this election, but I think change is a broad word. And I think the anger was really aimed at Washington, which we had identified very early on. And a real strength for Donald Trump was that he had nothing to do with Washington ever. He was the antithesis of Washington in a way. His strength and authenticity also led to unpredictability and almost being a bomb thrower. And in the, universe of politics, there's an old adage that your greatest strength is usually your greatest weakness. I think from our perspective, that was also his greatest weakness. He inflicted most damage on himself. You could talk about the bias of the media all you want, but it was his own words that caused the biggest problems for him. And so that was also his strength, though. And at the end, with a macro dynamic that was whether it's rooted in change or someone who would really shake up Washington, which in all honesty, Hillary Clinton could never be. That was going to be the biggest hurdle. We would have to try to define change and differences on terms that did relate to people's lives and making a difference in people's lives and putting them first, which also in the exit polls on people who said cares about me was important. We won on those voters also. We couldn't overcome that. His strengths aligned with that macro dynamic in a way that was able to obscure a weakness that drove his unfavorables up to 60% during the campaign almost before the general election.
This is something I want to ask on both sides. You all made a decision, though, that the main line of argument that you were going to take into the general election was that he was unfit. And she started it with the Chris Cuomo interview and then did it at the San Diego speech where she really went after him on foreign policy and national security. In retrospect, did you put too many eggs in that basket? And from the Trump campaign side, when you saw that seemed to be the main line of the argument, were you happy with that? Were you worried about that? How did you respond to that? What did you think you needed to do about it?
We knew that, first of all, cut foreign policy into several different pieces. There's several different pieces of it. There was dealing with terrorism, military preparedness. There's several different buckets there that you need to look at. You all look at it from a very large perspective, but voters have their own little niches that they kind of fall in there. And we knew that going in, that voters saw Donald Trump as a strong leader. And that being a strong leader at a time when people were uncertain about their personal security, and don't forget, that's not only going on. We have policemen being shot. We have other things that are going on at the same time. And that strength played its way across the foreign policy spectrum. What they wanted to frame the race was, do you trust him to have his finger on the button? That's really what they wanted to frame his race. If they wanted to talk about the Iran deal and her diplomatic capabilities, we'll talk about that. If they want to talk about what she wanted to do in Syria, we'll talk about that. If they wanted to talk about the Iraq war and what happened as a result of the Iraq war, we'll talk about that. So it was really a very narrow thing they were trying to make is, do you trust this man with his finger on the button? And at the end of the day, what a lot of voters didn't buy was that it was ever going to be a time where you had to worry about his finger on the button. This wasn't Barry Goldwater and it wasn't Lyndon Johnson. We weren't living in a Cold War era where you had Russian nukes pointed at us that we were worried about taking that down. So when she came at us there, we shifted it back to terrorism. We shifted it back to Iran. We shifted it back to Syria. And all of those grounds were fertile grounds for us with voters.
Could we hear, Mandy, would you respond to that? Just because I would guess that you don't think that this was a narrow critique that you guys were putting up.
No, to the point that Kellyanne was making earlier about people who disliked both of them. When we spoke to people who disliked both of them, and we know that was a swath of the electorate, two things troubled them and about Donald Trump, and the fact that he would blow up the world and was erratic and had made reckless statements and would embarrass the United States. It would, I don't think we ever had a focus group where somebody didn't say he's going to blow up the world. I just can't. I just can't do that. And obviously, we'll get to all the divisive issues later. But those were the two things that were very present for people. They didn't require understanding the details of the Iran deal or any policy. It was just a visceral sense that they didn't trust him in the role of commander-in-chief. Dan, you asked, should we have spoken more about the economy, less about those leadership qualities? My basic belief, and I said it this morning, is when you lose by 100,000 votes out of 130 million, everybody else was right. Like, everybody who's got a theory about what we should have done, like, knock yourselves out, you're all right. Like, we should have done more on the economy. We should have talked more to farm voters. We should have had Bernie Sanders on the ticket. Everybody has a theory that could have gotten us 100,000 votes, and they all might have. So I don't know the answer to that, but I do understand why we did what we did. And we did talk a lot about the economy, a tremendous amount, actually. And it was, as Jen was saying, extremely hard to be heard on that topic.
In this early stage, Judge Curiel became front and center, created a controversy created by Donald Trump. What did you all do when these things occurred? How did you try to handle Donald Trump, if at all? What was said to him about these things? How did you try to get him to stop doing it? What was going on inside the campaign? Or did you simply say, let him do whatever he wants? This isn't a problem? Corey, you want to?
I had the privilege of being in that San Diego event when Mr. Trump called out Judge Curiel. And we had talked about it on the way to the venue. And, I made the strategic recommendation, as did others, not to do that. Donald Trump is going to do what Donald Trump wants to do.
But help us understand this. So you say this, as you said this morning when the John McCain thing happened. You give him advice. When you say don't do that, does he just simply clam up? Does he say, Corey, I know what I'm doing?
No, Donald Trump is a person who takes input from a lot of people and listens to every side of an argument before he makes his decision.
But was there anybody telling him to do this with Judge Curiel?
Not that I know of, no. But look, again, you have a person who has achieved remarkable business success, relying on their own gut to build a $10 billion corporation in a place where he was never supposed to be successful, which is Manhattan. And his instincts of what the American electorate have wanted and what they have been looking for have been so spot on. And he has been so successful in the business world that, candidly, look, it's very difficult, I think, for any one person to give him advice on something where he has a mindset on and change that opinion. That's how successful he has been. And I think when there are issues like this, and this narrative gets developed on the Judge Curiel thing, it is always the team that comes in after this has been done that tries to talk him into understanding either the severity of it or that it's time to change a narrative. And what we know about Donald Trump is he has the ability to change a narrative with 140 characters.
I just want to add, and understand, here is a man who had never run for office before, had just cleaned the clock of 16 prominent Republicans. We're not talking about the munchkins here he was running against. We're talking about governors, senators. I mean, prominent Republicans cleaned their clocks, took them to the cleaners, and every time he had a situation like Judge Curiel, everybody said, oh, it's the end of Donald Trump. Political gravity is going to apply, and all the old rules we know are going to come in and he's going to lose. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. So trying to convince him when he feels he is right about something, the opposite oftentimes will only dig his position the other way.
Is there ever a moment where there's an argument made, but this is just simply wrong to do, right? Whether it's the way he did the Muslim ban initially, whether it was Judge Curiel, other statements that he made, simply that this is not the right thing to do if you want to be president of the United States. In other words, was that ever a discussion with him?
Not one that I had with him. I don't know if
Anybody?
anybody else had a conversation.
I've had a lot of conversation with him, but your fundamental question, I think, is wrong. I mean, he just tweeted out that burning the flag should be a crime, and I agree with that. I know what the Supreme Court has said. I think the American people agree with him that burning the flag is wrong. And the media gets all up in arms. Oh, my God, Donald Trump doesn't understand what the Supreme Court said. In a 5-4 decision, they said you can burn the American flag. I don't care what the Supreme Court said. Too many people have died for that privilege to have that flag there. And when you say, have you had conversation with Donald Trump to say that banning Muslims is wrong? Look, this is in the wake of a terrorist attack. This is in the wake of a San Bernardino person who came through on a K-1 visa, who the State Department didn't even do their due diligence in looking at their social media activity, and they went and killed 17 Americans.
Right, but he backed away from the outright Muslim ban several times to soften it.
I understand, but at the time, what the American people were talking about and what the American people were upset with was the lack of a proper vetting situation. And what he has said is until we can vet people appropriately, we have to be very careful who comes into the country. And at the time, on December 7th, when he made that statement, it was in reaction to the world activities which were taking place.
Let me try to get some reaction.
If I could, just 1 second, because Corey's exactly right. And let me just, and Dave Bossie, Mr. Trump had a unique ability to speak directly to the American people and go past the media, whether it was through 140 characters or making a statement somewhere. And he did it to change the topic. He did it for multiple reasons. And it's really was, at the end of the day, his greatest strength, because you asked a question about, Catherine asked a question about strength, and that's really what Donald Trump's greatest strength was.
Joel, can I get you to respond to what the Trump people have been saying about this? Because I think you've got quite different views about aspects of this and the way.
Anything in particular?
Start with Judge Coriel and the Muslim man.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, look, first of all,
in other words, how did you see all this?
All this, Joel.
so here's what it is. Look, you started off by asking us about the decisions we made on unfit, et cetera, and that spawned this whole conversation. We were never just trying to say Donald Trump was unfit or unqualified. We were trying to make him and expose him for the risk and danger that we believe he posed and poses to the fabric of America. And, you know, Corey, we can have this discussion later about the Supreme Court ruling, but if you say you're going to appoint judges in the mold of Scalia, who voted in the majority on that. So if you're going to respect them and say he's your model, you ought to pay some attention to the rationale behind his decisions and the appreciation for the First Amendment and expression in this country. But I think on each of those buckets, on each of those, well, I didn't interrupt you, Corey. On each of those,
if you want to attack me directly, Joe, I'll be happy to have the conversation with you.
I didn't attack you directly.
I understand, but at least give me the chance to respond.
I'm responding to you now. You can respond when I'm done. That's reasonable. We're not at a Trump rally,
Okay.
Corey. Come on.
Look, I didn't call you out by name, but I'll be happy to do that moving forward.
Well, it was your comment. You can call me out by name if you disagree with my comments. That's fine, Corey.
Let's keep the conversation moving.
We were always trying to make, because of the impetus here that was really about shaking up Washington and change. It wasn't just to say Donald Trump is unqualified. We were trying to expose him as a risk on national security, as a risk to your economic lives through his economic plans, and as a risk as someone who would divide this country at a time when we face big challenges that we have to come together on. So the strategy behind it wasn't just to say Donald Trump is unfit or unqualified. It was to tell a bigger story about Donald Trump, which we believe had some resonance with the voters.
Let me answer. May I just answer all the questions at once? That is true. And I'm sitting across from very gifted, very brilliant people. That is true. But Judge Curiel happened, I don't know, June 2nd or 3rd. And Hillary Clinton mentioned it on the debate in Las Vegas on October 19th. That is, 4.5 months later. So the idea that you were just trying to talk about the unfitness of Donald Trump in the main is not necessarily true. She kept going back to these examples again and again. And my earlier point is absolutely true, which is people had decided how they felt about that. It may have cost them some votes. It may not have cost them some votes. We all know the answer to that. But the fact is that if you keep on talking about the same thing and the same people over and over again, the electorate at some point is going to say, I heard you say that. But what about the jobs in Mexico or China? What about the lack of fairness I feel, that I get up every morning and go and work hard, and half of it goes to some big black hole called the deficit. I mean, in other words, we have to be fair. We can't revisit history here and pretend that there wasn't a lot of paid media and direct mail pieces that maybe a lot of people in this room who don't live in swing states didn't see, that was geared toward specific comments and specific individuals, like the Judge Curiel incident. And that preceded me at the campaign. But let me answer your question about who talks to him. I have had a practice of 2 decades plus of not divulging private conversations with clients. It served me well so far. But I will tell you generally what I've said publicly before, which is, number one, Donald Trump is at his best when he talks about the issues and when he takes his case directly to people, including in the rallies that many of you either mocked or ignored as being important. Number two, Donald Trump prefers people around him who actually challenge him politely and respectfully. He doesn't like people who sugarcoat things. He doesn't like a bunch of yes people. I appreciate that because I've been around politicians for a long time, and a lot of them expect, if not demand, yes people around them. He is somebody who, he's a transactional guy, folks. His life has been one big meritocracy. He's employed tens of thousands of people. He appreciates people who at least present a different perspective or maybe say, this is a better idea than that. And so I hope that answers your question without divulging private conversations. But, many of us are on the record publicly, having been all over the place, saying exactly how we felt about X, Y, Z, and Q, so you can roll the tape. But I hope that answers some questions, but I don't think that...
Let me pick it up with some follow-up to Jen or Joel or anyone on the other side. When you heard of the Muslim ban and Judge Curiel,
They're still talking about it.
I'm talking
Why don't we
about
just talk about winning? It's easier.
because we're trying to get a first draft of history of what was going on in both campaigns in real time along this timeline. When you heard those issues, how were you responding? Because there's a value system here. And so I wanted to give you a chance to say.
Yeah, I think that, I think there's an underlying premise in the conversation thus far that I don't think is true, which is, and that premise seems to be that Trump won because he was answering a broader call for change, and that people had faith that he would create jobs. The exit polls, which is the best we have to go on, don't bear that out at all. They say if you're voting on the economy, you're more likely to be voting for Hillary. I think when you look at when people went into the voting booth, if they were voting for Hillary or against Trump, more people were voting for Hillary than when you went into the voting booth, were you voting for Donald Trump or against Hillary, and more Trump supporters were voting against Hillary than for Trump. I think you guys, and you have a lot of experience at it, are very good at running against Hillary Clinton. I think, I was very frustrated in real time at our inability to break through. And I remember now what happened on our bus tour. What happened on our bus tour was Cannes. It was right after our convention, and that is when that's when Mr. Trump had all of his comments about the cons that went on for days, and we couldn't break through.
But
it was frustrating. But you know what? That was fine. I think that was fine. I think that was fine for us. I think if the election had been 3 days later, we would have won. Where we were in dire straits was when we were dead in the water and people were picking at us as opposed to the attention. Bad attention on Trump is better than Trump off in his universe, off on our universe, and that was when the press would pick at us, and that was when we were not making progress. But I think when we were pushing these issues, and Kellyanne's right, we made sure people knew about Curiel because it did hit a value system in America that is at odds with with some of our core values of inclusivity. And I think that continued to be effective until the day of the election. But, what hurt us was either them coming after her or us getting picked apart by the press. That's when we couldn't make progress.
Because the con issue was something that I think you all and the candidate wanted to talk about at that point.
Well, that day I wanted to talk about jobs on our bus tour. But, there's only so much, very little of this that's in our control.
We have to say
in
here, though,
retrospective, I was frustrated in real time, but in retrospect,
90% of our commercials were pro-Trump. 90% of our commercials. 100% of your commercials were anti-Trump.
Yeah, but don't you think that the paid media
Yeah,
part
it
didn't
was.
matter?
Most of them. Everyone was ad that was running
No,
at the
that's
very
not
end.
true. On our side, no, we had at least 40% was positive. Mandy would know better.
I would love to see one of
let me
those
ask you
pro-Hillary
about,
ads.
Can I
'Cause-
just respond to something though, Andrea? Because I think I'll just put it out there. I think there's a flip side to this change argument that we're also touching on when you talk about the cons and the Muslim ban. And that is also, I think Trump spoke to, and Kellyanne, this is why we continue to talk about it, people in this country who have a fear of change. And I think Mr. Trump was willing to, with his comments, speak to an underlying cultural and economic anxiety about change in a way that we just were not willing to do. And he was willing to be dishonest to do that, like his position on Iraq, and we were not willing to do that. And so I think when you think about the challenges and some of the issues that we came back to, and to Jen's point, on some of these things, we had a different value system that we were speaking to then, and we were trying to make a different argument to people who were afraid of or had concerns about, and half of my family are these people who, we just spoke to that in a different way, and that is a choice that we made.
I wanted to ask you about a key point in the campaign, both sides, which was the Loretta Lynch meeting with former President Bill Clinton. Because one could argue that Director Comey would never have had control of the outcome if the Attorney General had not recused herself. And so the Comey July 5th statement and the two letters that many people, including I know all of you, believe was so important, and certainly Nate Silver spoke to that, would never have happened. He would not have been the decider. What was going on in the campaign at that point, if you can tell us, Jen or Robbie, or, when that happened, did you realize it was a serious turning point? Did you think you could get past it? And then I want to ask the other side as to what happened.
Well,
Go ahead, Robbie. Get past what? We said get past it. Do you mean?
Did you think that it could be explained away? And did you think that there was any way that Comey would not then take over, or that Loretta Lynch could continue supervising, making the decisions?
It's hard to know, right? It's hard to know what Comey would have done. I suspect that it's not as if it wasn't a very, publicized. It's not as if the FBI review was not was not something of great interest to the press. So whether we'll just never know if Comey would have taken a different path. I have doubts that he would have. I don't know that it.
Well,
really
the outcome would have been the same in terms of the conclusion about not prosecuting.
Yeah, but are you assuming that if that meeting hadn't happened, if the Loretta Lynch meeting had not happened, you think Comey would not have done his July 7th press conference?
He would not. Yes,
I think he would have.
You think he would have?
Yeah.
Can I,
Just based on how that guy
Because that was an
But
unprecedented
since you're trying to
statement
do
by an
this-
FBI director.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
And
I
we
still
know.
think-
I'll go to the latter point. I'll stay in order of your timeline for a second, though. I think you're focusing on the wrong turning point moment. He does his announcement at a full-throated press conference and goes and testifies before Congress 2 weeks before the conventions. You then have two big events: their convention and our convention. We came out of the two conventions in much better shape than Donald Trump did. We expanded our lead. We ran a very good convention. They got, in our polling anyway, a minimal bump. So that was a big moment in the campaign, but it was followed 2 weeks later by what was going to be the last opportunity for each campaign to have a sustained, unfiltered period of coverage. 4 days of the Republican convention, 4 days of the Democratic convention. And we came out of that convention with the biggest lead we had at any time in the polls. Now, we knew it would tighten up, but so putting it in perspective, voters along the way are factoring all these things in. So at your moment that you're identifying one meeting, and a few days later there's a Comey report, and we know now in hindsight that Mr. Comey seems to care little about FBI precedents and will go ahead and do things whenever he chooses to. I think that the likelihood is that that had an impact that day, that when he does his press conference, much more so in the timeline. That is a bigger event than anything else.
You did not see that
and
as,
followed by the conventions.
Let me just say that according to all of the legal experts and the people who cover the Justice Department, he would not have had that platform to have that press conference, to make those announcements on July 5th, the very day that President Obama was campaigning with Hillary Clinton for the first time in North Carolina. Overshadowed by that event. That he would not have been able to do that if Loretta Lynch were the decider.
Yeah, that event just played right into the hands of those Americans who felt there was this culture of corruption, that the foundation, the Clinton Foundation, was a pay-to-play scheme, that whether it's true or not, that the paid speeches, the foreign money, every element of that stunk to high heaven to the American people in poll after poll and what we saw in rally after rally, that when that moment happened, it was a defining moment in the campaign because it gave the American people the understanding that maybe there is this culture of corruption that was pointed to by that very fact. And I think that played a role on that day and every day on.
But now, what about the fact that, as Joel just pointed out, they came out of the convention ahead of where you came out of the convention, but you're saying that it created an undercurrent that you could exploit later on when the opportunities arose?
First of all, it wasn't just one event. It was the entirety of probably a year and a half of the drip, drip, drip of the emails coming out of the State Department, of the WikiLeaks releasing material. That pervasive problem that they could not get out from under was a big problem. The event, that 30-minute or 40-minute meeting on the tarmac, was something that your imagination, when Donald Trump took the stage and explained it to people at rally after rally, it was something they could envision.
It also went to the sort of us versus them argument, to touch on that. And I think if this election proved anything, it's that there are more of them than us, meaning there are a lot more voters out there who feel that they are, as Mr. Trump says, forgotten man, forgotten woman, voiceless, not invisible to people who are, to coin a term, in elite structures or elite institutions, which would include politics and media and all of that. But to this point, about the conventions, there's no question that the Democrats came out of their convention doing much better. I took over management of the campaign almost right after that. But what I noticed is if everybody goes back and looks at the August travel schedules and the event schedule for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, that's the tail of the tape. See what happened in August, where I think you had a great bump out of the convention. You had a wildly popular president, wildly popular first lady, much more popular than your candidate, and other people coming out and speaking at the convention. She got a good bump, but then she almost disappeared. If you compare what Donald Trump did in August compared to what Hillary Clinton did in August, and I believe someone at a publication here is writing a story about it, I'm told, it's remarkable to me. It was remarkable to me taking over the campaign management when I looked at that and thought, well, let's go where she's not. And I said to Mr. Trump the day he offered me the job, I said a couple of things, but one thing I will divulge is let's figure out who she is and will never be, and let's do that and be that and go there. And there is a certain risk-taking that Americans love that I think we owned in this campaign. I think Secretary Clinton played a little bit safe in terms of the states she visited. I have it all right here, the counties it visited versus Michigan, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Minnesota. You know how you all covered it. What are they doing? I guess maybe they're building a Trump hotel there, haha. Maybe this is just fun. Maybe this is on their bucket list. How about maybe the internal polls showed at least we were now down by 2 or 3 in those places and not 10. And that we had a chance. And we also noticed that she had not returned to Wisconsin. We have no idea why. That all of a sudden you're dispatching President Obama and President Clinton back to Michigan or Wisconsin or both. I can't recall. But it's also the element of risk taking after these conventions. It's who's willing to, I think, just do more. I mean, Donald Trump opened the hotel. He took 3 hours to open a hotel with his children, a family project in Washington, D.C., and then went right back to North Carolina that night and that day. And it was criticized as taking time off the trail in a non-swing state, D.C. When Secretary Clinton took 5 days off before the last debate, everybody said, isn't that brilliant?
We're going to get
but it mattered to voters. I'm just making the point. It mattered to voters. How did you spend your time? And when you don't have as much money, as much personnel, you decide, where can I deploy my two greatest assets. This is my question every day. Where can I deploy my two greatest assets, Donald Trump and Mike Pence? And we had to look at our statewide polling. We had to look at where Secretary Clinton was going, where she was spending money. Had to look at the counties that looked, when you compare them to Senator McCain and Governor Romney, the counties that just seem much more ripe for a Trump type of message that was already connecting in places like Ohio and Iowa. So how can we take that, my obsession, Pennsylvania? I was completely obsessed with Pennsylvania.
Well, we just want to circle back just a bit on the conventions. One quick thing before a couple quick questions about the conventions. One is, was there any concern within the Trump campaign about using WikiLeaks as an attack? Obviously, it had been a big news issue, but in the past, Republicans. It's a very different environment in 2016 when Julian Assange was on Sean Hannity in 2012. Like Edward Snowden was sort of an attack point for Republicans. Was there any concern about using WikiLeaks or about being hacked yourselves in the Trump campaign?
Whatever the source of the material was, if it was on the front page of the paper, it's in the public domain. We would look at it.
Do you all
Absolutely.
not acknowledge that it was the Russians?
I personally don't know who it was.
Do
you?
U.S. intelligence. You just.
Oh, they know. So look. Whoever I don't. And to be perfectly honest, Dan. To be perfectly honest, To be perfectly honest, Dan, they made a calculated mistake. If they had put out all of the emails that Judicial Watch and Vice News and Citizens United and others had demanded out of the State Department in FOIA requests for the 2 years prior to this campaign, they would have solved their own problem. But instead, they used the old Clinton playbook from the 90s. They drip, held it all internally.
Is that the playbook that you guys used on taxes?
Yeah, winning. It was a winning strategy, I guess.
Well, just to clear up, 17 intelligence agencies agreed.
Andrea, we've heard this before. Okay.
So I was just asking whether you acknowledge the Russian complicity and that.
So I've read it in the Washington Post. I have to.
You've heard it from General Clapper in testimony. So the question is, they were hacked. They were stolen.
And they were. It doesn't make them untrue.
The emails are authentic. They've never said they weren't.
Yeah.
Not
no
one
from the
person
Clinton
has said
campaign
they were
ever
not.
said that they're not authentic.
Were you guys worried about being hacked?
Sure.
You were.
That's why
We know.
security on our email.
We know. By the
why
way,
do you think-
WikiLeaks released
were
some
you guys
of
hacked?
WikiLeaks released some of the
Were you-
DNC's emails that showed that WikiLeaks.
There's this thing
was-
called two-layer authentication that came out like 8 years ago. They should try it at the DNC.
Well, no, I'm curious because we asked at one point we asked the RNC a fair amount like what kind of precautions they had taken. Did you guys take precautions after the hacking?
Yeah, of course. Like any business in the world, we take precautions against all of our information technology.
Okay.
I also didn't write emails that I didn't want Dan Balls to write about.
Andrew, one thing, this is actually getting to your previous question, to sort of air a gripe for a second that we had, a lot of attention was paid on that meeting on that plane. Not a lot of attention was paid to the fact that Rudy Giuliani actually predicted and used the pronoun we, for a lot of to predict some of what Comey was doing, and there was evidence that he had an inside line on what was happening. And I think, and WikiLeaks is another example. I think throughout the cycle, the media had a posture, and not to sort of lean on Nate too much, but I thought what he said was very insightful. There was a sense that Hillary was likely to win this election, and I think as a result of that, a lot of the treatment and the reporting was such that if there was something suspicious on the Trump side, it would largely go uncovered. But if there was even the slightest suspicion on Hillary's side, it would be blown up quite a bit. And in particular, what we found very frustrating was that 17 intelligence agencies claimed that the Russians had stolen the emails from the DNC, stolen the emails from John Podesta, and then a report came out in the New York Times that Donald Trump had been under investigation for his connections to Russia. There were obviously a lot of questions surrounding Mr. Manafort and the connections there. And I think the coverage of what the Russian intelligence was feeding to the press versus the connections, the deep connections that Donald Trump had with Russia did not get commensurate coverage. And so when we talk, David, I think actually aptly narrated how how WikiLeaks created vulnerabilities and headwinds for us. I think a frustration that we had was the media didn't seem willing to put that in the proper context of the deep connections that Donald Trump
On
had.
the campaign level, when did you guys know that John Podesta had been hacked? And what kind of precaution? I mean, did you review email? I know you guys had a retention policy on your campaign email that was pretty short. But what precautions did you prepare in terms of a self-research on that?
Jen, do you want to talk about that fun
Nope,
period?
I don't.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, on the conventions, with the Trump convention, it was quite an event.
It was a great entry.
Yeah, no, it was cool actually. The way he came in. One big question, kind of thematically, because we got to kind of move. We want to get into the fall. So I just wanted to the speech that Donald Trump gave was very cohesive and a very coherent vision. It was pretty it was pretty dark in certain ways about kind of the state of America. Oh, you disagree? Okay.
Well, this is the fundamental problem. This is the fundamental disconnect. You have a country where you have 70% of Americans say it's headed in the wrong direction. Obviously, they're seeing, a majority of people are seeing the country that way. And it's you all that see it differently.
I would just say Hillary did win the popular vote. So when we're talking about a majority of the
But
country.
she didn't win.
No, just purely factual.
Oh, God, you guys.
You were running for 270. Listen, I know.
And we got more anyway.
What?
Okay, so you won the popular vote. And
say a majority of the voters endorsed his.
No, I didn't.
We only had
I didn't
1/7
say
the
that.
money.
I said a majority of the voters see the country headed
So
in
we
the
couldn't
wrong
advertise
direction.
everywhere. I mean, so we had to fight the media.
With
So
the
if I can't
campaign-
fight, yes, I had to fight the media. I had to find the media.
No, we had
Their
to fight
bias.
them every day. We had to
So in
fight it every day.
California, as they run advertisements as the largest super PAC called the media, we don't have any advertising to run against that at all.
Yeah.
So I fought for 270. Why would I go fight for the popular vote if I have 1/7 the money?
Right.
with that.
Yeah. So I mean, it's hard to say we lost popular vote, so that means we didn't do as well.
No, listen. You guys won. That's clear. You won the Electoral College. That's the currency.
that was
But
the fight,
let's also
right?
be honest. Don't act as if you have some popular mandate for your message. And Tony, we'll talk about the wrong track number again, like you and I just did. The fact of the matter is that more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. So let's put it in
And there was
total
nothing
context.
that said the road to popular vote anywhere. It was road to
Kellyanne,
270.
I
That's where we all competed.
premised my statement by saying that, but you can't then.
Hey guys, we won. You don't have to respond.
Okay,
I mean,
there we go.
seriously,
No.
hold on. Why is there no mandate? You've lost 60 congressional seats since President Obama got there. You lost more than a dozen senators, a dozen governors, 1,000 state
We're
legislative
talking about
seats.
this election,
No, you said there's no
Kellyanne.
mandate. You said there's no mandate. You just reelected a guy who represents liberal New York and a woman who represents San Francisco as your leaders. You learned nothing from this election about Tim Ryan's Mahoning County. You learned nothing about his congressional district. You're not even trying to connect with the white working class voters who we just won.
That is absolutely not true.
Okay, then why is
right?
Nancy Pelosi rewarded for her failure?
Look, I started off by saying that people wanted to shake up Washington. I'm not going to sit
It's
here
not
and
just
I'm not
Washington.
going to
He
have a
was the
debate
better
about
candidate.
Washington.
He was the better candidate. That's
let's
how he
have
won.
a debate. Well,
No, actually, let's not.
Actually,
Let's just
2.5
chill.
million
Let's
more
have-
Americans
excuse me.
thought she was a better candidate.
We're going to
Okay.
keep talking about the wait.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
If you want to go back to the
No,
wrong track
actually-
number,
No, I don't. I just
Yeah,
want to
but-
go back
yeah,
to the
but-
270 or the 306 that we won because that's how you win the presidency, and we did it.
Let's bring
No
this
kidding.
back to
All right. Well, would you like to continue with the conventions, or would you like to move on? Up to you guys.
We have one more on the convention.
The one more on the conventions was, I think you guys viewed the convention as a success for you guys. It was received well. One question though is it kind of goes back to some of the message issue. At this point, and I know this is a. Actually, no. I'm going to ask a different question, which is, one of the things that came up repeatedly, and we've talked a slight bit about the cons, but how did you put together? I mean, was that obviously you couldn't have predicted the overall extension of that, but was that
The
something
cons
you
again?
guys,
Did he
putting
run
people-
for office, the cons? I mean, this is amazing. How many times do you want to have the same conversation?
Well,
Honestly,
I mean,
it's not a deciding factor in the outcome of this race. Because if it was, they would have won.
Well, here's
So it wasn't.
Corey, we're trying to get-
We're trying to go through a series of
I understand, but
events.
it's the same event you've already talked about 3 times.
Okay.
You've asked 3 questions about the same event already.
All right. Here's the reason that I'm curious about it, and curious about it for different things with you guys too, which is just what was the internal methodology, the way you guys thought about putting one of those things on stage. Clearly, it was a point of media obsession in a lot of ways, but like, was that something you guys predicted? Was that why you put different people on stage? I'm just curious.
The conventions were important to us as the debates were, because our belief was it was when both sides came out of their own separate media bubbles and kind of watched the other side, and we could present Hillary unfiltered without the commentary. I know you all have problems with the media. We have our problems with the media. And
we agree.
Most of what people know about Hillary, they either hear from commentators, from the not always accurate things Donald Trump said about her, or from other media sources. Every time we could just show her, we were in better shape. And we also could bring the voices of people who knew her, who had their own credibility, as somebody said, president, popular first lady, to kind of bear witness. So those were very important moments for us. Those were always the biggest moments. Even the Benghazi hearings, unedited, unfiltered, was a huge moment for us. Real Hillary is better than the stories people tell about Hillary. So
let me ask you
that
a
was very
follow-up on that.
important. But just to answer the very practical question about Mr. Khan, Hillary had talked about him in a speech in Minnesota months before. Somebody had read a story about him. She gave a very moving section of the speech on terrorism about him. We had a sense that he would be powerful. We put him in the hour of prime time right before her speech. He would not have been a story if Donald Trump had not gotten into a stupid fight with him. Would have been a powerful moment, and that would have been it.
A question was raised earlier, and I want to give you a chance to respond, because you came out of a very successful convention. And then if you look at the last 100 days, by our count, Donald Trump made 133 stops in battleground states. Hillary Clinton made 87. A lot of this was, it was not just, there were only a few days related to pneumonia. A lot of this was debate prep, and some of it was fundraising. So I want to ask you about time management of the campaign in those critical weeks after the convention. Do you think that you put too much emphasis, something that none of us saw at the time, on the debate prep and on successful debates rather than retail politicking?
Can I just answer the last thing, and then Robbie can talk about the schedule? According to our friend Nate Silver, who did it, she won those 3 debates by the largest margin of anyone they've ever tried.
I didn't just.
And so the time it took to prepare for them, we consider worth it. Whether or not that what happened afterwards, whether there are scheduled questions is a separate question, and whether the last 3 weeks and what happened in those last 3 weeks after the debate is a different matter to me.
Which brings you back to Comey.
Can I say?
It brings me back to Comey, but also you want to talk about the schedule.
I think if there's one thing that I would change, I would go back and do, is I would go back and have pushed for a 4th debate in like the last 10 days. Because I think however how much time Hillary needed to prepare for those debates was worth it, because it was Hillary unfiltered. It was the clarity of the choice. It was the 2 of them on stage. It was dramatic. It was great television. And our problem was that the last one was 2.5 weeks before people actually started voting. So then Trump was able to go off in his self-contained universe, which he's very good at, telling his story and running his race when he's able to stay in his own universe. And we got picked apart.
What does that mean? I'm just curious what that means. I know it's a snarky comment.
You guys are good. He doesn't
talking to people at rallies.
He doesn't. He has his rallies. He delivers his message.
The self-contained universe is what? Pennsylvania or Michigan? What is it? I'm just curious.
Self-contained universe means that he doesn't. You don't. I think your challenge, I think both of us had challenges with media. Your challenges are different than ours were. And
Jen,
your
there are
supporters-
publications, with all due respect, there are publications represented in this room. I like to think I have good relations with the media.
So do I.
There are publications in this room that for 2 weeks before the election were running nothing but headlines. The path is over. The race is closed. Hillary Clinton doesn't even talk
I'm
about
aware of
Donald
that,
Trump
and that I think that
anymore.
probably hurt us. But I'm saying
I agree. By the way, I agree.
We
I
both
agree.
have. I mean, we both had our own. We both had our own challenges. But I think my point is, when we were at our best when we were able to be on stage with Donald Trump. You had the clarity of the choice. It was, and we could never replicate that when the two of them were in their separate silos. We could never, there was nothing Hillary could say in the last 2.5 weeks that would have the power of anything that she was able to say when she was on a debate stage with him. And the same was true for the primary. Those were always our best days. And I think if we had, so I don't, but we had to raise money in August and we had to do that. That's the fact of our campaign. And we had to do debate prep, and I don't begrudge any of those days. I wish that we had come back around in the last couple of weeks and asked for a fourth debate.
Would you guys have agreed to it, David?
Yes.
Kellyanne?
Absolutely.
I think you
look,
would've.
I think so. Look, you guys felt, I guess, that you did well in the debates. We did the same, and I think that the results of the debates and the days after, the intensity of our events, the intensity of the people that we were seeing in these battleground states just grew after the debates. After the first debate, which I think was, that was the first of, the first one was the weakest debate for us. It was his first time debating one-on-one, and there was a lot of issues related to that. It really wasn't the debate. We looked at it maybe as a draw, maybe as a slightly, Clinton victory there. But it was really the couple of days after that ended up being the problem from a news cycle standpoint. But I think we would have agreed to another debate because Mr. Trump, now President-elect Trump, got stronger, we felt, in the debates because his debate prep was getting better and his performances were getting better. And you guys know, it took less and less prep because he was already there. And I think that his performances in those debates were outstanding. And they really showed up in the attendance. We had to get bigger and bigger arenas. And that goes to, if you're asking a scheduling question, what we did from a scheduling standpoint was just continue to put on the pressure. And that was really strategically continuing to put on the pressure because Mr. Trump, would go out and, he would give 2 speeches a day in 2 different states, and then we would go to 3, and then we were doing 4, and then we were doing 5 a day. And so when you're doing that, you're creating pressure on the other team. And Mr. Trump would say, she's taking a nap and I'm giving my 4th speech in my 3rd time zone today. And that left I think a big impression.
Let me ask you a quick question about being a male candidate against a female candidate, because the whole narrative of she's taking a nap and, the pneumonia and all of that, how did you as a campaign, was that
a gender, taking naps and getting pneumonia is a gender issue?
Well, I'm just asking whether you had any reluctance in framing it that way, in running against a woman candidate, in criticizing her for strength, which arguably shouldn't have been an issue.
Well, when she had her, I think it was 9/11.
It was 9/11.
That was on film. So, that was what people saw. So he didn't, that's not that's not something about her gender.
All day. It happened.
No, and he didn't say anything all day, but then there became the litany of her
The
health.
polls showed it
nothing to do with
bothered
gender.
people. It had nothing to do with gender. I mean, I'll speak as the female campaign manager about gender. We saw early on that, of course, this country would vote for a woman president. But the question is this really about a female president or that female president? And there are lots of voters who were reluctant to vote for Hillary Clinton because they knew her, because she represented what they didn't want this time, which was insider privilege, elitism, wealth. I went from dead broke to $250 million. They're welcome to make that kind of money, but people have a right to ask, how did you do that? Who gave you that money and for what? I mean, we saw that she had made $262,000 on average per speech there for a while. I think that's terrific. I'm open for that. Anybody? I think that's wonderful. I had a better cycle. I had a better cycle than she did. No, but seriously speaking, I think that's great. I mean, then she was giving speeches for free, and hardly anybody was showing up to them. So people had a right to ask that question. But on gender, it wasn't a hypothetical. It was Hillary. So it's not just a woman, it's one that people had lived with for quite a while. And I mean, I think this in many ways, people are trying to overcomplicate the results of this election, even if they were unforeseen by most. I think that the sort of scrappier, more entrepreneurial, risk-taking, more compelling candidate won again. That often happens in our political world, by the way, our presidential world. And I think for the first time in my Republican Party, since I've been a very vocal critic of it for years, this was the first time that the Republican Party resisted this tug of electability, starting in the primaries. Who can win? He can win. He can't win. She can't win. It's like the Democrats have been masterful for decades of resisting this fiction of electability by actually elevating and then electing people who were told, you can't win, don't even bother, wait your turn. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, certainly. And they just say, thanks for the advice I didn't ask for, and they run and they win. You got two-term presidents out of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And the Republicans are basically like, let's nominate the person who lost to the person who won as some kind of consolation prize. That's weird. And this was the first time where voters said, I have so many choices and so much time, I'm going to poke the fruit a little bit longer. And electability got replaced with electricity. And then I'll utter two words that haven't been said here that I think are relevant to us also. Bernie Sanders. I think what Jeff and others did on the Sanders campaign was helpful to us because it exposed a weakness that Hillary Clinton had in these states that we went back to once we took over the campaign, Michigan. And it's certainly Michigan, Iowa, for example, where they basically tied. And so I don't know, we have to overcomplicate it.
But I'd like to hear from someone on the Clinton team about this issue of gender and how you saw the way Trump was talking about some of these issues. Did you see it as an attempt to denigrate a female candidate? Do you agree or disagree with what Kellyanne said, that it wasn't an issue of electing a woman candidate, it was a question of electing Hillary Clinton as the first woman candidate? How were you evaluating that, not at the very beginning, but as you were going through this in real time in the fall?
I don't think we know yet all the different ways the gender affected how people looked at this. And that was true in the primary, too. There were a lot of gender undertones to what we dealt with. And I don't say that's the reason we lost. I'm just saying it was a factor in how people looked at candidates. The Bernie bros and the vehemence and the anger and the hideousness, frankly, of what was said online and to our people and so on. I've never really seen anything like it. And those are our Democrats. They support a guy who we have great respect for. And you couldn't read the hatred and the vitriol without being kind of shocked by why, Hillary has had people become irrational and it creates sort of an irrational response. This was really irrational. And I think we saw some of that both with Donald Trump and his supporters. I remember the day that Donald Trump said that Hillary Clinton wouldn't be at 5% if she wasn't a woman. Well, look, you can disagree with her. You can say she's the wrong woman for our times and all of that. But that's a ridiculous statement for somebody who served as a United States Senator and Secretary of State. She was going to be at more than 5%. There were a number of different ways that I thought he sort of was trying to come to terms with her that tried to diminish and denigrate her. Now, he's an equal opportunity bully, so some of it was about gender. He certainly insulted all of his primary opponents to good effect, too. So I don't take it just as, as being about gender, but there was certainly a filter of gender in the way that he dealt with her. And I think that people looked at the two candidates.
But look, down ballot female candidates, which is most of our experience because we don't have a lot of experience with presidential candidates that are female. Down ballot, female candidates often have some advantages, and one is that they're seen as fresh and new. I mean, Joni Ernst in Iowa, for example, certainly Patty Murray when she was running a long time ago in Washington State, PTA mom, I believe. Joni Ernst, we've never had a female representing Iowa in the House or the Senate. This is fresh and new. Nobody saw her that way. Female candidates are seen as good negotiators, consensus builders, genuinely interested in reaching across the aisle and trying to solve problems. A lot of people did not see her that way. And they also see women, by and large, as, incorruptible, more ethical. They're not part. There's a reason you've never heard the term the old girls network. There isn't one. And she couldn't, she didn't have that advantage either. But there could have been. Stay tuned. But she didn't. To me, we saw this. I looked at this and I thought about all the work that I've done over the years with female candidates and as a Republican consultant against female candidates on the Democratic side. And she didn't have these advantages that sometimes will gain a female candidate down ballot a point here or two, or give them a fair hearing, I think, with the electorate that maybe she was denied by and large. But I also never understood why there wasn't this hue and cry. My office is right there on Fifth Avenue. I saw no parade of America's women saying, we must have the first female president. We must have the first female president. I didn't see them on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. I mean, it wasn't there. And I think that Hillary Clinton had a gender gap with men that was never really solved. If I had to pick the two groups that we overperformed with, it would be, white women, which you were supposed to win 60% of, I kept hearing everywhere, and union households. But if you only got what President Obama got against Mitt Romney among women with a female candidate, it tells you something, even among female voters, that they were looking at, maybe they'll say she shares my gender, but not my vision or not my values or not my position on these particular issues or not my quest for change.
We're going to come back to modeling and polling, and we are going to jump into just a couple more timeline things. One quick question that I did have is for you guys, when there was, and obviously some of it depended on states and that sort of thing, when there was a lot of softness with young women during the primary, did that worry you about the general? In terms of just young women supporting Bernie?
Look, I think we had a challenge. We sort of talked about this before. We had a challenge with young people in the primary. One thing was abundantly clear when we got to the general election, which was that young people were, this is a generalization, but they weren't supporting Trump. It's not like they were leaving Hillary and going to Trump. Our problem was that too many of them went to third-party candidates at the very end. And in fact, I don't know what the Trump team was seeing, but we saw both camps consolidating these third-party voters at the end, as normally happens. I mean, I know in other, in races I've done, usually third-party candidates get half of what they are polling, a few weeks out on Election Day because your people come home. We saw that process happening. One of the things that concerned us quite a bit was that after that first Comey letter, that process stopped for us. But it continued for Trump. And when, again, you look at these three states, you look at those 100,000 voters, to Mandy's point, there's a million reasons. But I think when we specifically talk about the effect that Comey had, I actually think, to what Kellyanne brought up before, no, we didn't perform. I think when you said 60%, I think that was typically specifically with college-educated white women. We didn't perform where we needed to. We didn't. And particularly, Philly suburbs is a great example of that, or outside Milwaukee. But that's the drop that we saw.
And do you think was there an over-reliance on celebrity endorsers and surrogates in terms of reaching some of those millennials?
No, I think millennials, and other people can answer this here, our message to millennials was a values-based message about the kind of country that they wanted to live in, the kind of future they wanted to have, and the things that they believed. And there were many celebrities who were willing to go out and say that, but the stronger together argument, wasn't only communicated through celebrities.
And I think when you look at the numbers at the end, Andrea, and Robbie's right, and Tony and I did something before this where we were talking about the consistency, and Kellyanne, you've polled for a long time, the high level of people, the high number of people who were staying in the third party zone as late as they were, like between 8 and 12 points in October, was really unusual in a presidential race. I had polled in '96 when we had Perot.
To what do you attribute that?
Well, I think Kellyanne mentioned that, there was kind of a Bernie hangover with some folks. When you look at the exit polls, people under the age of 45, which includes a lot of millennials, voted at about 7 to 8% third party or other, and people over 45 were only at 2%. We had always analyzed our data by going from the two-way to the four-way first. We always had two groups, Trump defectors and Hillary defectors, people who were with them in the two-way. And for most of it, it stayed kind of even, drifting into the four-way, so the lead didn't change much. When we consolidated after the third debate, which was when we saw some solidification of our defectors, Trump's defectors had started coming home before ours. They were Republicans largely, independent-leaning Republicans. And the impact of the Comey letter was largely on those third-party voters. It stopped. And the last 11 days, we couldn't get them back. So I don't think it's about celebrities or reaching them a wrong way. I think they were a tough group. We throughout most of the campaign, were not hitting Obama-like numbers with younger voters, but we got there in October. We got there after the third debate, and then it drifted back away from us again after Comey's first letter on
Dan,
Friday.
can I say something about being the first woman candidate, since this is for history, and I don't feel like we, on our side, got to really address that. I heard a lot, I'd be fine with a woman, not just this woman, and probably nothing, I find nothing as no statement that you would hear in the campaign as disconcerting as that. Because, yes, this woman that walked through the fire of what this presidential campaign was for her in terms of both through the primary and the general, and this woman that stayed at it for 40 years, and this woman that broke all the rules of how people perceive a woman. I talked about this a little bit in the Democratic primary panel, but I think Hillary was not just, I think part of her problem is she doesn't have a peer on the national stage. Her life is very unique, and so it's hard for people to relate to her. But also, she doesn't have a peer for us to compare her to. We have other women senators that we can compare them each other to, but there's no one to compare Hillary to. And as a baby boomer, she was a generationally challenging figure. Certainly, as a first lady that had a career, she didn't stay home and bake cookies. She broke a lot of rules, and women candidates, I think, are given some of the benefits of the doubt that Kellyanne noted until they violate certain norms of how women are expected to behave. And then they just become very challenging. And I think that is, I think that's a big part of what happened to Hillary. And that's why when you hear people today say things like, there's something about her I just don't like, there's something about her I just don't trust. And you look back at interviews from the 1992 campaign with man on the street interviews, and people saying, there's something about her I just don't like, there's something about her I just don't trust. And I think it's how challenging of a person she was as a baby boomer and as a first woman that is there. And it's not easy to convince women to vote for women candidates either. And I went to the University of Delaware right after the election, and spoke with a lot of nice young women who supported Hillary, and they said, wow, her concession speech was so great. It was so noble and so moving, and why didn't we see more of that? And I said, yeah, because it's okay for women to do? Be a gracious loser. That's okay.
Jen, is it possible that people actually don't like her or don't trust her?
I think people think they do not like her and they do not trust her, but I don't think that there's. I really. Do
you think it's unfair? You think it's unearned? I
really do.
You do?
I've really thought a lot about it, and I really do. When you try to, this is what I think about her. I think that she's somebody who's in politics that doesn't like the spotlight. Mm-hmm. That's a weird thing, right? Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, they walk in a room, they're not the center of attention, they're unhappy. Hillary Clinton walks in the room, she's not the center of attention, she is fine with that. So she's a private person, and that puts another layer of defense that is unhelpful, that hurts her, and that's a problem.
Unsafe.
And that hurts her, and that has made all of our that's made the campaign more challenging. And she admits that. She knows that her first instinct can be to pull back and be protective, but also she's had 30 years of a lot of good reasons for building up that armor. But then I do think the other piece of this is breaking this new ground and challenges. It's just she's been an uncomfortable presence for a long time. And so she's not without fault, and she's pretty stubborn. That's part of her success, though, is like the ability to just get up every day and, do what she's got to do that day and get up the next day and just keep going. And I have a lot of admiration for that. But I think that's, I think we need to understand better what lies at the crux of what people don't like and don't trust.
I also think, Kellyanne, you talked about what traits people usually respect in women candidates, and I've been fortunate to elect 6 women to the Senate, and I agree with you. A lot of it is outsider, it's honest, it's compassion. What it isn't usually is strong and ready to be commander-in-chief. And you may think the country is ready for a woman, any old woman, just a different one. There are very few people who will ever meet that test. And I hope I am wrong. I hope we're ready for the next time. But we all take it for granted that this woman was, so easily accepted as, of course, she can run the country.
Did you see that in your data, though, if you don't mind me asking, that people don't...
Absolutely. And in fact, if you looked at our data, and I remember this even in 2008, but it was particularly true in light of being Secretary of State. If you looked at the data without gender attached, you would have thought she was a man, given what her strengths were, which is unusual, and I actually think was an asset. As much as the liabilities you're talking about were true and we struggled with, that was an asset that is rare and will make it difficult for any other woman who doesn't have those qualities to get near the presidency.
Can I just add one thing here too? And I spoke to some people about this last night at the dinner, but and Corey, you sort of hit on this earlier. Donald Trump was very deft at using the podium to switch up the news cycle, and by and large, the news coverage on him was a critique or a criticism of what he was saying, albeit many times negative, but it was an amplification of what he chose to say. I think when you compare head to head, the media was by and large not covering what Hillary Clinton was choosing to say. They were, again, treating her as the likely winner, and they were constantly trying to unearth secrets and reveal and expose so that the voters who were likely to pick her could be positive in their choice of choosing her as our next president. And then you put on top of that Comey, you put on top of that WikiLeaks, and when you ask about this trust issue, I think there are gender dimensions to that. I'm not going to get into that, but I do think that the coverage itself perpetuated too much focus on that question in particular, and whether that capacity should have been devoted to presenting what she was saying. When Donald Trump talked about a Muslim ban, that was a policy position. I sure as heck wish people would have covered Hillary Clinton's desire to tax the wealthiest Americans more. That's controversial.
Robbie, we covered it. Robbie, do you think?
No, but I wish it had been covered more. But the other thing I'd say is Donald Trump refused to disclose his taxes. He refused to disclose his business connections. It wasn't covered. It wasn't covered.
Oh my God!
No, but here's my thesis.
That question was vomited to me every day on TV. Just so we're clear.
Yeah.
But not with the same obsession.
Oh, it was an obsession. Of course it was.
But you would have to agree.
It was button number 3, Robbie.
It's getting covered more now than it ever was during the campaign.
Robbie, let me take you back. I know we're talking about the general election, but how much do you think the problem was preceding the general election that the email controversy precipitated by the private server reinforced those issues, and for correspondents covering the campaign on the listening tour and afterwards, the questions that were being asked, the stories that were being demanded, all mostly related to the negative. Since this is for the sake of history here, I think we all have to be excruciatingly honest about what happened in the media, all of the media. The focus was on a controversy, a hot-button issue, against, the dramatic entry of Donald Trump into the race, rather than opioids or the other substance of the listening campaign. And that carried over into the general.
Look, if you're asking if that was a headwind for us, absolutely. I think my point is that, people say, well, it's important because we need to understand her decision making. We need to understand how she'll handle things in office. Fine. Why wasn't there the same attention to Donald Trump's decision making about his business? Why didn't we look into his bankruptcies? Why didn't we look into who bailed him out in those bankruptcies? My point is that there was this hyper fixation on this one issue for her that I think was largely driven by the fact that people thought that she was going to be successful in the race. And I think that if people had thought that Donald Trump had the same chance of winning as she did, I think there would have been the kind of fixation you're seeing now on his business connections, because the idea that he would serve in office and these things would present a conflict of interest would have been much more real.
Hold on, Andrea. We had one of the top people at the New York Times come to Harvard University and say, I'm willing to go to jail to get a copy of Donald Trump's taxes so I can publish them. That's what he said. Dean Baguette came here and offered to go to jail. You're telling me he's willing to commit a felony on a private citizen to post his taxes, and there isn't enough scrutiny on the Trump campaign of his business dealings and his taxes? It's egregious. He should be in jail. And all of a sudden, 48 hours later, what happens? Mysteriously, in my mailbox, I happen to have these taxes. With all due respect, are you telling me there wasn't enough scrutiny on Donald Trump's lack of releasing his taxes when you have the top person at the New York Times willing to go to jail to publish a document illegally? That's unprecedented. If that was Hillary Clinton, the media outcry would be insane.
No, what you heard on Hillary Clinton was, this really says a lot about your character. Can we trust you that you're not revealing this? You never heard people say to Donald Trump, gosh, like, what is this? What does this say about your character? The way you respond to this issue, the way he responded at the podium, it's so curious. I mean, is he really being forthcoming in his refusal? I mean, the hyper obsession over every sort of aspect of that, I do not think was reflected. And again, to the point that you guys all made, that was because Donald Trump changed it up. Every minute there was something new and controversial for the press to chew on that deflected from that.
Robbie, with all due respect, I seem to recall 3 debates where every chance Secretary Clinton got, she made a point of talking about how Donald Trump didn't pay $950 million in taxes.
I'm talking about the media, not what we said.
Right. But I mean, the fact that, but wait a second.
Yes.
Wait a second. They found that out through the media. They found that out through the New York Times. And on top of that, it isn't like you didn't have a chance to say it, or that Priorities USA didn't have a chance to run it. I mean, there was. And voters looked at it, and the voters decided that wasn't as big a deal as, at least in those states, as something else.
The media actually decided it wasn't as egregious as covering emails for 2 years. We have an unprecedented situation now where a president, by dissembling, saying he couldn't release his tax returns while they're under audit, which is completely not true. I know that might unsettle you, but that happens to be the fact. Refused to release his tax returns for the first time in 4 decades. It's a precedent now that probably will be sustained by other candidates. And in fact, what we know from 1 year, however it came about, Corey and others, was concerning to some people. Now, the question was about media coverage, as Jen just said. And if you look at the number of stories about that, you may have been asked about it, but the number of stories about his tax returns, other than the one time the New York Times got a copy of them, pale in comparison by exponentially to the coverage of emails. And, on the email thing, if I can.
We need to move on.
All of a sudden, the media doesn't want to hear about it.
I'm sorry, the emails were...
Look.
Yeah, but the emails were different, folks. I'm sorry, the emails were different. She was under FBI investigation.
There's a big difference. There's a big difference. And you guys call it headwinds. You guys call this headwinds.
And Donald Trump was under investigation for being
I call it
connected to Russia.
Self-inflicted wounds. Okay? You call it headwinds.
Connection.
There was no Russian connection.
He was under investigation by the FBI.
Oh, my God.
I mean, that didn't get covered the same way.
Vis-a-vis the public, though, that's not true. People were bothered by the investigation.
Listen,
That's
you guys call it headwinds. We call it a self-inflicted wound, what you guys were going through. Let me just remind everybody. the other self-inflicted wounds, because Jennifer reminded me when she said baking cookies. I mean, Hillary Clinton established herself in that 60 Minutes interview when she said, "Do you want me to stay home baking cookies?" And it
wasn't in a 60 Minutes interview.
That's right. It wasn't. It was at that. It was at the Jennifer Flowers.
No, it was at the Busy Bee Diner in Illinois, and I asked the question
you did, yeah.
that elicited the answer.
And so it was. Thank you for the correction. We'll yeah, and thank you for the question that day. So the issue was Jennifer Flowers. The issue was the Whitewater land deal. The issue was her as First Lady doing the healthcare task force. The issues were the Rose Law Firm billing records being under subpoena for 2 years before she brought them forward. The issue was her firing the travel office staff and then putting in her own cronies. Those are the reasons that the underlying issues from the 90s stuck with her.
And Donald Trump's issues in the 90s weren't reported the same way by the press. That's my point.
Oh, my God.
Okay,
stories.
Look,
there's some people don't like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. There's a lot of people, and people don't like the media. That's okay. We'd like to move through a couple just events that happened in the fall, just to kind of record how you guys responded to them, that sort of thing.
We want to talk about the shakeup in the Trump campaign in August and everything that sort of put on the table. We've just gone through a lot of discussion about gender, the arrival of Steve Bannon to the campaign, the intersection with Breitbart, the speech that Hillary gave about the alt-right. All of those issues became front and center in the campaign in August. So I first want to ask the Trump people, what was the reason for Steve coming into the campaign? What concerns were there about some of those issues that were being raised as a result of him coming in?
I was fired by then. I don't know.
It's the first time Corey has ducked.
Right?
All right, then. Steve and I were hired together. And the reason Steve Bannon was hired is the reason that he's going to be the chief strategist and special counselor to the President of the United States, is because he's a brilliant tactician who has been a Goldman Sachs vice president, is a graduate of the Harvard Business School, steps from here, engenders all types of laughter from people who don't know him, and
No, it's just that you're bragging about Goldman Sachs.
who he
funny.
just beat, and he also he has the rights to he has part of the rights to Seinfeld, which really tells you what a great negotiator he is. Somebody couldn't afford a deal that they were doing, and I think the show was rated in the 25th or 35th in its first season, and he got the rights. And he also, of course, yes, thank you, naval officer. But I think that you've cherry picked. I've said this many times. Some headlines trying to make, I don't know, when Hillary Clinton gave her speech in Reno about the alt-right, I just looked at that and I thought, is she running against a website now? It was confusing to me, frankly, because I know Steve and I know what he brought to the campaign. But it was also confusing to me because it just seemed so beneath her. You're talking about she was Secretary of State and she was a United States Senator, and she flew to Reno at a time when she wasn't doing that many campaign events anywhere. Fundraisers don't count. And gave a talk about a movement that I frankly consider myself reasonably intelligent and a well-read person knew nothing about. And he will bring the same, strategic brilliance and intelligence to the White House for the president. I know that people who are still trying to fight this last war of 3 weeks ago, who seem immersed in the permanent campaign, who certainly are in the, stages except for acceptance, are now trying to besmirch Donald Trump through one of his top advisors. And I think, again, as I said earlier about some of the issues, the country will see through that. And they will give this guy who said in the wee hours of Wednesday, November 9th, that he would be the president of all Americans, not just those who supported him. I think they'll give him a chance to form his government.
Do you think that was the message he sent out through the entirety of the campaign?
What, that he be the president of all Americans? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's who he's going to be. He said it when he was elected,
No, but I meant during the campaign, given things that he said and did during the campaign, which, part of the reason that Steve Bannon became something of a controversy when he was brought in was because it seemed to dovetail with some of the things that Trump had said during the campaign on issues of race or religion or, constitutionality, those kinds of things. So
I've got a question. I was in the campaign since the beginning till the end. And what specific instances are you referring to about what he said about race and religion?
we're talking about the Muslim ban. We're talking about what he said about Mexicans in that opening.
Illegal immigrants is what he was speaking
Mexico's a country.
The idea
No,
that
Judge Curiel couldn't do his job because he
of
was
his Mexican
Mexican
heritage.
heritage.
Even though he was from Indiana?
Con. I mean, we can go through the list, but I mean, it's not as though there weren't moments in the campaign where he created controversy having to do with race or gender or religion.
But Dan, can we?
But how does that affect? But Steve, your question was about Steve Bannon.
Well, because
Okay.
it was because
I mean,
of his
you're trying to
association with Breitbart.
dovetail the two things. So when Donald Trump said something in January, February, March, April, whenever, had nothing to do with the smear campaign of the left on Steve Bannon today. Okay, and well, it's ridiculous. And to be candid with you, the guy is an unbelievably brilliant strategist who is really a terrific guy who, as Kellyanne just said, a guy who has a Harvard pedigree and is getting attacked by people who have no idea who he is.
Wait, hold on. Okay, no.
Well, I mean, we happen to be sitting here, but listen, he gets held to a standard that none of these other folks.
Well, let me.
If providing a platform for white supremacists makes me a brilliant tactician, I am glad to have lost. And give me a minute, David. I am more proud of Hillary Clinton's all right speech than any other moment on the campaign because she had the courage to stand up. I would rather lose than win the way you guys did.
No, you wouldn't.
Yes.
No, you wouldn't.
Yes.
That's very clear today. No, you wouldn't, respectfully. Rather, I'm sorry, how exactly did we win? No, go for it, Jen. How exactly did we win? I'd like to know because I've sacrificed the last 4 months of my life to do it. Excuse me. And we did it. And we did it by looking at the schedule and looking at, yes, the electoral map of 270, because that's how you win the presidency. And we went places and we were either ignored or mocked roundly by most of the people in this room, but I have a smile on my face at all times. And we did it by focusing with Steve Bannon and Dave Bossie and everybody you see here. They're going to say, oh, she just said Corey was part of the campaign. Jeff Zucker. Okay, Corey until whatever, what was that, June? And we focus on how you win. We connected with voters. We connected with voters.
Hiring is himself. We've already gone through some of the examples of his own language, his own positions that I believe are at odds with my value as an American of embracing diversity, inclusivity, equality. And hiring someone like Steve Bannon,
which is exactly what Breitbart is.
Who with Breitbart.
If you guys just spend a few minutes on Breitbart,
give these people a platform.
You say things doesn't make it true.
One of my proudest moments of her is her standing up and saying with courage and clarity, in Steve Bannon's own words and Donald Trump's own words, the platform that they gave to white supremacists, white nationalists, and it is a very important moment in our history as our country. And I think as his presidency goes forward, I'm going to be very glad to have been part of the campaign that tried
to. Jen, do you think that excuse me, she said white supremacists.
Well, I would actually like to follow
sorry. I know it's mentioned a lot on your
that.
website too. Do you think I ran a campaign where white supremacists had a platform? You going to look me in the face and tell me that?
It did. Kellyanne
really?
did.
Oh, and that's how you lost?
It did.
Do you think you could have just had a decent message for the white working class voters? Do you think this woman who has nothing in common with
I'm not
anybody,
saying that's why you won, but that's
these
the kind of
counties
campaign
we
that was
flipped
run.
over
Yes.
200 counties that President Obama won and Donald Trump just won. You think that's because of what you just said or because people aren't ready for a woman president? Really? How about it's Hillary Clinton? She doesn't connect with people. How about they have nothing in common with her? How about you had no economic message?
Guys,
we are. You guys are not.
They want this to be about a strategist. That's right.
You guys are punching down. It's unbelievable.
You know who you're talking about. One Steve Bannon. Well, there's another Steve Bannon as the CEO of Breitbart. he himself has said that was a platform for the alt-right. Folks from the platform. Now, you just 2 weeks ago, in the rise of the alt-right, which is now part of the mainstream of our politics, America is for white people. So don't tell me, and that is the kind of platform, there's a video of it. That is
No. Prove yourself what you just said, Karen. Prove yourself. Okay? Prove yourself. The alt-right is the mainstream American politics.
No, I said now they've come to the mainstream. Part of what Donald Trump did in this campaign was to mainstream the alt-right.
You're just wrong.
I actually have a question about that specifically for the Clinton campaign.
By bringing Steve Bannon into the campaign and now appointing him to the White House and Jeff Sessions potentially as our Attorney General. You have had
Karen,
well, you guys are bitter.
I have a very specific question about the alt-right. Which is,
I be very gracious. You're bitter.
White say that they see Donald Trump as their standard bearer, as their guy, and now we've arrived. So are you telling them that's not true?
Not true.
Kellyanne,
Absolutely
may I ask them a
not
question,
true.
please? So one question that we did have, there was a bit of a debate. The alt-right is a real thing. Steve Bannon has said that. That's true. But it was a fairly obscure movement. And there has been a debate about whether Hillary Clinton naming them this summer, did that give elevation? And just in the sense that, obviously I would anticipate that you might say you were responding, which is a fair thing to say. But was that a concern with the campaign that you were elevating something that was fairly obscure into the mainstream dialogue?
And did the comment about the basket of deplorables provide energy to the Trump campaign down the stretch of the election?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, their error with the basket of deplorables, their candidates' errors were much more important than any one person that you want to smear today.
I'm sorry.
We're
not trying to smear anybody. You say let's talk the truth. No, let me say something, David, without interrupting me. I haven't interrupted anybody on your panel the whole day.
Except me.
Steve Bannon said he created the platform for the alt-right. We have seen Richard Spencer have a group of followers in Washington, D.C., giving the Nazi salute during his speech about that. When you ask Kellyanne about what did Donald Trump say, I'm waiting for someone here to tell me who you're taking the country back from. Is it my grandparents who came here 2 generations ago? I'm trying to figure out who that message was for. Was it for the people in the
tried all that.
Was it Kelly, I'm not trying to relitigate it, but if you want to, no, I am not.
You're certainly not being analytical.
I am certainly being analytical. Across the 6 key battleground states, the large ones that we contested.
But we saw 14. The problem is we saw 14 battleground states. You saw 6.
There was 6 where the tipping point states
14.
were. Fine, Kelly. We know we started with 14 across Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio,
we ended with
Pennsylvania,
14.
Florida, and North Carolina. In each of those states, that's right, and you did. And I have said from the beginning, you won the campaign. But if we're talking about the history of the campaign, there were dog whistles sent out to people. And in those states, 20 to 31% of people said that they believe minorities are favored in this country, that's how the country works. Donald Trump won those people by 6-1 to 10-1 in each of those states.
Donald Trump
Do
also
you ever
won more
think that it was your
African-American
left-wing
votes.
policies that were driving people to that thought, not some website that no one ever heard about?
Well, a lot of folks have heard about Breitbart, but to Joel's point, from the very beginning of Donald Trump's campaign, he was very clear, and again, I agree with Jen. I'm very proud that in our campaign we would never use those kinds of tactics.
You called him a sexist, a racist, a misogynist, xenophobic daily. And it blew back on you because it's not an aspirational, optimistic message. How in the world did we have a female candidate whose closing arguments were so negative? Where's the uplifting, aspirational, visionary message of Barack Obama or Bill Clinton? The 2 presidents she was trying to succeed. Where was it? It was all about Donald Trump. She was obsessed with Donald Trump. Obsessed with calling him a racist, a xenophobe, a homophobe, a sexist, and guess where it got you?
And the basket of deplorables.
Message was she's being indicted. I'm going to put her in jail.
No.
I'm going to lock her up. Really?
Yeah, look at our rallies.
Go look at your
rallies.
Kellyanne. Look at your rallies.
All those people. The rallies mattered.
He delivered it, and your ad did it every day, Kellyanne.
What are you talking about? His closing message was about bringing jobs back to this country, which he's in Indianapolis today doing exactly that with Carrier before he's even the president. It could have been done, but he had to do it. His closing message was about being fair to the American worker, making America safe and prosperous again. His closing message is about reforming the Veterans Administration, where your president and my president, President Barack Obama, has presided over a dysfunctional VA.
Actually, our closing argument video didn't even have Hillary in it.
Making Americans safe again from Muslim Americans and immigrants to
Guys,
this country.
I can tell you're angry, but wow. I mean, hashtag he's your president. How's that?
You know what?
I was asked 100 times on TV. They're all here, maybe 1,000 times. Will he accept the election results? Will he accept? Will you ever accept the election results? Really? Will you tell your protesters he's their president too?
Hashtag
Teddy's
Kellyanne,
funny, right?
I
know you weren't expecting it, but seriously, he's not your president. You weren't raised the way I was to respect the office of the presidency
Kellyanne,
and who occupies it.
Look, my point back to you is hashtag,
yes, we won.
If he's going to be my president, then he needs to show me that white supremacy is not acceptable doors, just steps from
a million times, and you know it. Now you're just lying.
Not ever with the veracity
Get out
that he
of
has
here.
attacked.
He did it in the New York Times on the record. I was right next to him last week.
We're going to call a halt to this for a moment.
Ridiculous.
I want to put this on the Clinton team. We're obviously going to not get to everything that happened in the campaign, but
How do we go to November 8th?
but the biggest unknown at this point is what happened in those last 10 days. By the conventional measures that you would look at a campaign, you won the conventions, you think you won the debates, you lost the election. What happened in the last 10 days? Catherine, I turn it over to you to go down through some of that.
Well, and I know, like, thematically it's going to be, so, like, what I would be interested in, just to start, maybe, like, one or two specific things that you did that you would do differently, or things that you wouldn't change but might have hurt.
I would have done another debate. That's our problem is when we don't have a means of engaging, it's just we get picked apart. And and we did even talk about it very briefly. As a matter of fact, Robbie and I had a conversation on the plane on Friday morning about should we push for a fourth debate because we were just kind of dead in the water. And weren't getting traction on anything. And then Kristen Welker said, have you seen this story that just posted about the FBI opening an investigation of the emails? And our wireless didn't work for an hour, just like the lights going out. And then we got overtaken by those events. I think that would have made a difference.
One question I had for both, and we'll circle back around to you, just to like start with, there's been so much, and obviously we started right before this with Nate Silver, and we talked a fair amount in here about polling and modeling, but like there's a real conversation to be had about that because, you know, I'm sure there are exceptions, but for the most part, people expected that Clinton would win in the final days, and people expected that the Trump campaign would not win. That obviously was very not true. And so as a factual point for both campaigns, I'm curious when you guys stopped polling. And then I'll start with you, and then we get into like I'd actually like to know what the 14 states were.
It'd be actually nice to talk about the actual campaign. We haven't actually discussed it. All we talked about is the media and press.
Well, we'd like to know what both.
I mean, I think we haven't talked about how the ground games were
we'd
different.
Like to know
I think
what
we
both
talked
of you were doing, seeing internally in those last 10 days.
I mean, I think there were
and how you were
significant
responding
differences.
to it.
I think one of the things is we spent 50% of our money on digital and 50% on TV. So that's a groundbreaking thing for a presidential campaign. Would everybody agree? I mean, I think previous to that, most people spent 15, 20%. We spent $100 million on digital and $100 million on TV. That's a pretty big change. Our ground game was operated through the RNC instead of operating more independently. The RNC was the best blessing that we had as we came out of the convention. The RNC was ready for a plug-and-play ground operation with a data-centric view, and I think that was a huge win for us. We didn't have to build our own ground game. The RNC had built an operation. We didn't need offices. Why? Because we had an app. We didn't have to rely on old paper door-to-door knocking. So we didn't have to build offices. I think all these things are things that actually I think people might want to hear.
Yeah.
That are significantly different between the two campaigns.
What worked best for you digitally?
I mean, look, I've been pretty public to say that Facebook and Twitter helped us win this.
No, I mean like substance. Like what was the substantively on those platforms?
We built universes that targeted we knew the 14 million people we needed to win 270. And we targeted those into over 1,000 different universes. They cascaded them exactly with the things that mattered to them. We didn't let the media go to them. We went straight to them. And we spent the money in digital to do that because we couldn't compete with them on TV.
How do you, obviously we have like the election results, but like, were there areas of the country that you see like a specific, like,
Yeah, I
what you
mean,
can see?
we won exactly where we laid our money, other
For
than one
example?
state. Wisconsin,
Wisconsin,
Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. We started pulling out. We pulled out of Virginia because we knew we were going to win Michigan.
So with like Wisconsin, like what for, you know, like
We were buying TV in Wisconsin, and they didn't have any TV there. And these were decisions we saw from our modeling. We also expected a different turnout model than they did, and I think that's the biggest difference.
So
we expected a more 14-style midterm, and I think they expected more of a 12 Obama. Especially putting Obama out on the road, they expected more of those people to show up. I would imagine that's a Robbie question. And it showed more like a midterm.
What,
Robbie?
So under that modeling, I moved my money based off of that type of 14 data.
One more for you, and then we'll kind of go back and
Sure.
forth. But what with the modeling, what was a surprise for you? Like, you know, I'm sure there was.
It depends on what day.
What I mean, on election day. You know,
I wasn't surprised on election day. I pretty much knew on Friday before when the ABEV results are coming in that we were going to win. Because the model, they had too much room to make up in the 30 to 50 year olds, and the demographics, African American turnout was down. Millennials that were showing up in the right places for us. The turnout model was looking way too strong our way by Friday, Saturday.
Do you agree that it was the Comey? Do you agree that it was the Comey letter?
No, I actually
not at all.
Actually, hold on. Let me say this. I was on the plane with Mr. Trump the day before the Comey letter and showing data. I actually disagree with all this. I've never said that the media little inputs have had this dramatic effect. We pulled 1,500 live calls a week in every single state, 14 battlegrounds the entire time. Our data was showing the day before the Comey letter, we were already starting to get those crossover, or the swing voters. We were starting to get the third-party candidates to come in. Those things were already coming our way. Now, I'm not saying the Comey letter had no effect, but I see that we were already pulling back into a lead the day before.
That's also true in the ABC poll. That's also true in the ABC poll.
Let me ask Robbie a question about that. When did you know that you were in trouble in Pennsylvania? As you added Pittsburgh on the final day, we were asking you why you were adding Grand Rapids. Why were you going into Michigan? The answers we were getting was, well, they weren't early voting states. When did you see, if you could give us, the Friday before or the Thursday before, were you counting too much on early voting and cannibalizing your actual turnout on Election Day? And the ad of North Carolina at 1 a.m. on the eve of the election or the day of the election after Philadelphia. How did those decisions get made?
Well, I think on your question of cannibalization, I think the states that were most surprising were not early vote states proportionally. Michigan, I don't know, was 10% early votes, something like that. I think Wisconsin was closer to 20, and Pennsylvania was basically none. I mean, it was under 10%. I don't know that those two things are correlated. I think that, first of all, I think we did a lot of the things the same way that Brad did. And we were doing, 400 calls a night in these states. We saw, as I mentioned earlier, we saw the consolidation happening. We expected the race to tighten up as a result of that because, as we talked about earlier, there were so many undecideds in the race. I think, again, what we saw as a result of Comey was that it was just a major disruption to how that happened. And as I said earlier, well, let me say this. At the beginning of the race, Kellyanne was talking about how many battleground states there were. We set up a ground game in 14 battleground states at the beginning because what we saw was when we tested either a generic Republican or Donald Trump specifically against Hillary Clinton, basically did a one-sided argument against her. We saw that Wisconsin, Michigan, even Minnesota were particularly volatile in that situation. So it really, the answer to the travel is both things. It was both that Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin were late voting states. They weren't early vote states, but also that those were the states that had the most volatility when trouble hit. And we went through this pattern a number of times as Jen was saying, we'd do better at the debates, and then something from WikiLeaks would come along, and those numbers would move around. And look, to Brad's point, my guess, and Teddy should weigh in on this, my guess is we probably conducted our voter contact very similarly. We conducted a study, an experiment over the summer with direct mail, television. Actually, if you look at our early television buying, it's very patchworked by markets. And that's because with television, mail, digital, and actually volunteer phone calls, we wanted to assess with control groups what was the most effective medium for which segment of the electorate. And what we found was with people under 40, digital and those phone calls was by far not moved favorability, moved the vote. For people over 40, it was television and direct mail. So to Brad's point, I not only did the proportion of money we were spending on digital grow, but we targeted it through modeling, but that often skewed by age. So I would say, and Teddy can speak to this better than I can, somebody under 40, we were probably spending, in terms of the budget strategy, 90% of our money for them, on digital, but for folks over 40, that spending skewed much more towards mail and TV. But maybe Teddy can.
That's right. I mean, our media spend was largely dictated by this major experiment that we did over the course of the summer. I don't know if you did something similar. There would have been no justification, as far as I can tell, for spending half of your money on digital, and I'm a digital person.
I think more of ours is budgetary constraints.
So that would have been, in the context of a budgetary
cost
constraint.
per dollar per voter.
But there can be no argument, even Coca-Cola and Nike don't make the argument that 50% of a media mix should be digital. So
I was just saying it's a story.
I feel that I'm satisfied with the amount of money that we spent on digital. I think had we anticipated the Comey event, obviously. And what that was going to do in the final days to our millennial attrition to third-party voters, we might have leveled up a tiny little bit. But I think we basically not only did the right things, but ran the most innovative digital campaign ever. And I speak as the person who was President Obama's digital director in 2012. The 15% of Americans who lack access to the internet are the 15% of people who are most likely to vote for Donald Trump. It's hard to argue with that. These guys talk about voter contact via app. We developed an app that allowed people to contact voters via text message. We discovered that was our most effective voter contact tool on a per contact basis, in addition to the fact that the contacts were more efficient. And we had 2 million people contacted on Election Day alone via that tool. So I just don't think there's any credibility to the argument that we had an old-fashioned campaign. Quite the opposite. I think we had the most innovative campaign ever.
Were there any things that didn't work, like that were just like total busts?
I think. I guess I think we. I apologize. Yeah. No. You guys are annoyed when we use the word headwinds, so I apologize in advance for saying headwinds. I think. When we were talking about email, and you asked us to move on from that, but that. I think that, first and foremost, and there were some other incidents that occurred, obviously, created a dynamic in which it was uncomfortable for people to be full-throated in their support of Hillary Clinton. And so lots of people were.
Just to understand your shorthand, do you mean, when you say email, you mean the private server?
I mean the fact that
Wiki,
from the first private server, from the day the campaign launched, there was this perception of some sort of a cloud hanging over her in the campaign, which affected some people's actual enthusiasm, but really affected a whole lot of people's willingness to express their enthusiasm. And that's why we saw enthusiasm reflected in polling, and yet we had this phenomenon of, very measured statements of support on the internet, on the ground, and even to the extent of these private Facebook groups.
So you mean like social support? Like you couldn't get like organic social support?
I can't help by virtue of my My experience is comparing the situation to that which President Obama has always enjoyed. And, for President Obama, there's no cost to a person in many parts of the country expressing their support for President Obama. If they tweet out their support for President Obama, that makes them look cool to their friends. That's no problem for them. That's not risky at all. And the same was not true for us. And so we had people. What's that? Pennsylvania. So yeah. So we had millions of people who, again, when they were actually polled, expressed great enthusiasm for Secretary Clinton, but perceived and then actually experienced, when they would give it a shot, a bit of social risk to them if they were going to express that. They experienced that in the primary, as Mandy mentioned, and they absolutely experienced that in the general. It's interesting. My personal Twitter account, I've been doing nothing but say bad things about Republicans for 6 years. It's not until this campaign that I got these awful replies.
Did you get death threats? To your house?
Yes.
Yeah. Written in letters?
Yeah.
No, I'm just digital director? No. All right. So just
I'm
curious.
not. I think there are ways in which the internet.
I got multiple death threats written in cut out little letters on my car to my house.
My sister had
it was
three
definitely not
cars
easy
last
to be
night.
working for Trump. So
Last night.
I think that's
think
a unique case where I didn't really see on the internet doing this for 620 days. I never really saw people go, "Oh, you can't say anything about Hillary Clinton online." There is definitely Trump shaming. So that's just crazy.
Let me just say, Brad Parscale and Jared Kushner and their team ran the greatest digital campaign, I think, ever. They're modeling what they were able to put together in our targeting on a day-to-day basis, on top of our conventional polling. Was really what gave us an edge. It gave us the ability to, when I was trying to do the scheduling and trying to decide where to, we were trying to decide where to put Mr. Trump, now President-elect Trump. We were looking at that modeling, and it was truly a remarkable thing to watch every day. But let's go to Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, and Iowa just for a moment, because when we went in, Brad and I and others went into the networks just like you guys did the week before the election. No one believed that we were going to win those, or at least Florida and North Carolina. Everybody pushed back. As a matter of fact, after our briefing with Fox, they moved North Carolina from leaning Hillary, which they had just pushed over to undecided. And then a few days later, over the weekend, they moved it back to leaning Hillary. So we were running against a headwind that people believed with Fox, that they believed that we were going to lose both Florida and North Carolina. And our data, when we were looking at the ABEV numbers, we knew we were going to win those. We knew, North Carolina as an example. We were going into Election Day 300,000 votes, 305,000 votes down. And we knew that was a big enough.
I just want to say on that, I think probably both sides of the table think it was a headwind for ourselves that people perceived that Clinton was going to win. We faced really steep challenges throughout in terms of recruiting volunteers, raising money raising money from small donors, and we would hear from people that part of the reason for that was that they expected us to win. 2 weeks or so before the election, Edward Snowden himself tweeted that it's never been safer to vote for a third-party candidate, and I'm sure that's part of what drove a lot of his devotees to vote for third-party candidates. So I just want to note, I think it probably hurt us more than it hurt you, in my personal opinion, that people perceived that we were going to win.
Could I ask, by the way, I agree with that, but let me just ask one quick question of the Clinton team. Because it was certainly part of the story heading into the election that you guys had a massive advantage in terms of the ground game and perhaps on the analytics and just the whole
I disagree with that ground game thing. That's the most. I know, but okay.
We're talking about the perception, not the reality.
Yeah. So did you agree with that? Did you underestimate what they actually had in terms of the mechanics and the ground operation?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And look, actually, David, just to clarify for you too, we actually, when we did our network briefings, we hypothesized that we were going to lose all those states except for Florida. So we did, yeah. We should have slipped you the memo. I don't know the answer to that. I don't. Like, in fairness, they ran their program through the RNC. We ran ours through the state parties, sort of financially, and in effect, it's the same mechanism. I think that in certain, I wasn't especially familiar with what Chairman Priebus had done. But based on the news reports, they had dispatched staff early. A number of our state parties, Ohio is an example, Virginia's another, had brought on staff quite early. I think, and we touched on this it was this morning, I guess, or no, it was yesterday, on the question of the ground game. The ground game is a marginal effort. I mean, everything in politics, I think, is marginal. And somebody very aptly brought up yesterday, I think this was yesterday, that the earned media is such a powerful force in a presidential campaign, the way it isn't always in a Senate or governor's race and so on. And I also think that, in primary campaigns, the ground game is more important. When I did a governor's race in Virginia in 2013, where turnout was an enormous strategic imperative, that ground game was so important. Our ground game was there, and I assume for the Trump campaign it was the same thing. It was there to get you that extra 1-2% that you needed. We put everything that we could into Pennsylvania. It wasn't enough. I think if we had not had a ground game in Pennsylvania, we would have lost by, instead of less than 1%, it would have been by 2 or 3% or something like that. When you're a campaign manager and you're staying up at night and kicking yourself and thinking, what the heck could I have done? Would I have had 300 field staff in Michigan instead of 2? Absolutely, because we lost by less than a point. And so more of that ground activity could have made a difference in those states, absolutely. But I think, none of these things are sort of monolithic. They all come together, and as Mandy and everybody said here, these were such small margins. There could have been a million things, but I don't have a good assessment of what their program was versus ours. It could have been the same. It could have been better. I don't know.
Let me just talk to that for just a moment, because that was something that I worked heavily on. First of all, the RNC did an amazing job, and when I got there in late in the campaign in August, the RNC and we basically dovetailed our efforts, and we didn't have the time. I didn't have the time to build anything, to build it on our own. And what they had done over the 3 years of building their modeling, building their ground operation, was nothing less than tremendous. And what they had, one of the other advantages is they kept the same field staff, not everywhere, but almost everywhere, from the 2014 cycle, which is a huge advantage. Instead of having to relearn who the volunteers are, relearn the area, parachute people in, you had the same people organizing the same volunteers over again, and it was a tremendous asset. So our phone program, our mail program, our door knocking program, which were extensive, our volunteer effort, which for both phone and door knocking, on top of the paid side of things, was incredibly robust, more so than anybody, I think, understands. That the lengths in which we were in every one of these states with an incredibly robust, even though there were articles, and it had Mr. Trump at the time, calling us routinely about the ground game, about offices, the stories about that we would see. They have more offices than we do. They have more of this. Guess what? I sat back and we were like, we didn't care. Sorry, we're not going to react. We're going to run our program. Brad's modeling.
Can I add
we couldn't do anything anyway.
I think the one thing about the office thing that was just frustrating with all the news cycle was we don't have offices, we don't have offices. And what the RNC did in partnership with us by using the iPhone and the Android devices, where you walk out your door, you can start going knocking doors. We didn't need a centralized location. And with our budget, it didn't make sense for us to go make all those offices so that they could sit there with the door closed.
It was
and I think that's
Obama
a big change.
2008 model.
Well, look, I don't mean to say.
Well, I'm just saying the press was saying we don't have a ground game because we don't have as many offices as you. That was a dumb argument, and I think the one thing the media got wrong about the ground game.
No, and that's fair. And I don't know. I mean, you guys.
No, I'm just saying that office is not the argument for a ground game.
Yeah,
the offices
fair.
themselves, the
Yeah,
physical
yeah.
addresses.
And look, to your point about people sticking around, we one of the advantages of having a primary in all 50 states was that we actually we did keep people, for example, our Ohio staff, so on, we kept them in those states. So effectively, in many places, we'd been able to start in March. Those people flipped over to state parties. And look, we had to make a call in May, even when we were, we spent a lot of time campaigning to win the California primary, but we started building up early. And we were very fortunate to have that time and have those resources to the state party.
Robbie, I want to ask one question. We want to throw it open to the audience, but it's kind of a takeaway question, and that is, at what point, because you clearly went into Election Day still believing you were likely to win, at what point did you know the election was gone? And as you have looked through, and Mandy made a good point, there are 100 or 1,000 reasons that you could, but you all must have done some look at this. Where did you fall short in terms of the votes you needed, in terms of what groups, and when was that apparent?
Yeah, I think when the results started coming back in Florida and North Carolina, for that matter, we were concerned about African American turnout, but also our performance, as the performance in among white voters against what we had modeled as likely to happen. That we weren't matching that performance, and you're making me remember such a wonderful moment in my life. When we saw that, I remember us thinking, well, maybe this is just a Southeastern thing, and if that's the case, we're going to be fine. If that's not the case, we're not. And it wasn't just a Southeastern thing. I thought that what was laid out earlier about the numbers was very accurate, which was, I do think everyone, us, ourselves, I can't speak for the Republicans, although I'm hearing some of that reportedly, and then certainly for news outlets, was that we weren't measuring the white vote correctly, particularly in these rural areas. I think Nate laid it out correctly that we were getting people on the phone who were more likely to be Hillary supporters. We were asking education level, and we were waiting towards that. I know other people in the Democratic universe, despite that, we were still getting the number wrong. And I think that's something we need to study a lot more closely in the future. And then, African-American turnout was down in some places. Every state was a little different. For example, Philadelphia, the turnout was where we needed it to be, but those suburban college-educated white voters did not perform where we needed them to at the model. And again, we saw that drop because of Comey, and I really do believe that. So every state is a little bit different, but we do have big questions moving forward, and Joel can speak to this better than me about how we do survey research in the future.
Although, as a reminder, Black women did show up. We did our part.
Dan, I have two other
last
just
word, and
small
then we'll
examples.
throw it open.
One is in Pennsylvania, just as an example, because you brought it up. We were doing polling. Who was doing the polling for Pennsylvania?
Me at the end.
Okay, so Kellyanne and Brad had two different sets of polling data going on, but when we were going in there about 12 days out, maybe 10 days out of the election, we went in there and we did two events on one evening, an afternoon and an evening rallies in two different parts of Pennsylvania. And then the next morning we were back in Pennsylvania for an event, a huge rally. And the polling data showed us closing from, I think, 6, 7, 8 points over that we were at about 12 days out. It showed us closing dramatically after that 24-hour period. So we poured it on with events in Pennsylvania, bringing him and then Governor Pence into the state over and over again, and that really helped
Ivanka
us.
and Melania.
And to add to that, we really backloaded all our media buys. We had to, and you guys know that. I couldn't spend the money early, so I had to hope that
we were
ABED result,
right?
And we spent 50 over 100 million in the last 12 days, 14 days. I mean, I didn't have much choice.
And the last point that I'll make is the Brexit issue. We didn't know. Everybody was talking about whether this Colombia FARC, the Brexit undervote, whether there was this undervote there. We just didn't. No one knew if it was going to happen here in our election. And clearly, the pollsters got it wrong. At 5:01, when I got the exit polls that day, we still weren't getting accurate information until we actually got the votes that night. But that Brexit issue of the undervote definitely helped us because it was the people not telling pollsters. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, I think that's partially unfair. I think that our internal numbers had us tied in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
They had
I'm not saying everywhere.
And Joel and I talked about this before, and I think it's the media's pollsters and the media that needs to pick one poll and stick with it and stop talking about every poll like it's a tracking poll from the previous poll when it's a different pollster with a different methodology. And so if I had a nickel for every time we had to explain the methodology of a poll to the president-elect, we could have funded a really big campaign. Trust me. We could have funded a really big campaign because he doesn't really care. He doesn't really care about what it is. He just wants to know why is the number the way it is. Well, they don't have as many Republicans as they should have. They have too many of this, they have that. But I think our internal numbers, and we talked about this, Joel and I think we saw very similar things. The thing that made, and I know Brad's numbers were, the thing that Brad's numbers were looking at based on the analytics were turnout. And the question was it going to be there? In fact, we specifically talked about Florida, my home state, done a ton of races in Florida. And when I looked at the early vote and I was telling them, we need to pour on more mail and more stuff like that, which they did.
Florida was not our best ABEV, though.
No, but they did. I know. But they did. And we stayed, competitive at least in Florida. But when you looked at the ABEV vote, you said to yourself, well, wait a minute. Look at all of these new Hispanics that are turning out in the Orlando area. Look at all these new, you know what I'm saying? So in your mind, it kind of raises questions in your mind. But the thing that nobody really had a good handle on was we saw in our surveys among Election Day voters, we were crushing you guys. I don't know what you saw in your surveys. But among AB and EV voters, you were winning. But among Election Day voters, we were crushing. The question is whether or not that intensity would stay the same by the time it got to Election Day to do it. And in our case, it did. And in fact, 4 counties in Florida alone make up the difference between winning and losing that state. And so I think the internal polls were a lot more accurate than the public polls that we were seeing.
One question, and then we want to get people, like the students, and then a couple audience questions before we run out of time. Is same question to you guys. When did you know on election night?
That's a difference between different people on this table.
Yeah, sure.
I think
I'm interested. What's the
I told
difference?
Mr. Trump, I think it was Friday night. I felt it. He looked at me like I was crazy, so it's all right.
For me, October 22nd, when I told him.
Well, I'm saying from the data, though.
Yeah,
that was
I thought I was going to win 620 days ago. I mean, let's be honest. But
well, but how about on election night? What's the thing that where you were like?
I think ABEV results made us feel very good. I mean, do you agree with that? I mean,
so
no, I mean Florida was the only one.
Florida about 167,000 votes. Romney had lost Florida. We lost it by what, 80,000? Well, it wasn't on. I think Romney had lost Florida in the early vote by about 167,000 or so. We lost it by, 88,000, almost in half. So we felt that we would need a strong performance. We heard from folks in the know that in Miami-Dade, for example, something like, by 6 or 7 p.m., somebody reported to us that the Democratic vote that had been cast in Miami-Dade County was 100 or 120,000. And we said, wow, that's really low. They cannibalized themselves in the early vote. So we saw things like that. And by the time we were looking at the returns in Florida, and I told Mr. Trump on the phone, and then he came down to the war room to watch the rest of the night until we went over to the Hilton.
So in Florida, though, I have to say, we were worried the Hispanic vote came in high. The rural vote hadn't showed up in ABEV yet.
And then
I don't know if it's blood from the stone over 65, a little bit. So, yeah, I was nervous about Florida going into it. But as we know, the rural vote showed up on election day. But I think as you went north and you went to Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, Michigan didn't have much ABEV, but not Pennsylvania, but Ohio really, you knew it was going to bleed out from there. And you could just see in the ABEV results was like, this looks really good for us.
I agree. I mean, look, I think Ohio and Iowa pretty early on we were saying this is not going the way it needs to for us.
But the Hispanic vote went more for us in Florida than most people thought, and I think.
And I think that our theory is ever so slightly, and we think that's because of Cubans, like particularly in Miami-Dade County.
Yeah,
that's our guess. I don't know that maybe on the phone they.
And then the rural vote showed up on election day.
But I agree with that.
That
And then
and
North Carolina
exurban
when we
counties.
became more pessimistic. Is
Yeah,
really
Florida's always an interesting.
All right, let's move on to questions from the audience. Students?
From the students, you have microphone?
Yeah.
I'm interested to know when, if ever,
The mic's not on.
The answer is no before you
Okay, so my question was, when, if ever, did Donald Trump think or was certain that he would win the election?
That's a great question. I'm not answering for you.
Well, I can tell you in the primary we used to play this game. What do you think my odds are today? Right?
He was doing that day.
I mean, it's every day,
We were
right?
doing that last night.
Yeah.
No.
Right. What do you think my odds are of winning today? And so that was kind of the game that was always played. Sir, I think it's 52%. Okay, I think I like it's just a random number.
By the way, when I think Nate Silver was changing his on election night, he went from
the New York Times too, though.
10% to 23% to whatever the percentages were, and it kept going up. And he would get somebody would show that to him, and he would chuckle that his number it was getting better by the minute. But it was he took this very seriously. He was watching we were watching the election results. We had a war room next to the war room where he was watching, and those folks were just grinding out numbers, county by county, state by state. Florida had us a little bit concerned based on what we thought some of the big urban centers where the votes weren't coming in as fast, and we were wondering if that might change at some point during the evening. I think you guys were probably wondering the same thing, hoping it was going to go the other way. But it was as we were going through our accounts, county by county, and we had a team just focused on Florida, looking at every single number. That really, as they got north to maybe Jacksonville, I made them change to North Carolina as we were concerned there as well. It was closer than we wanted. But once we knew we had both of those, Ohio and Iowa were very good for us going in. We felt very confident. And then we had to win somewhere else. And
I would say that particular night that Mr. Trump was, he's a transactional guy, and he's somebody who knows the deal is not done until it's done. That's the way his career has been. And when we saw certain things happening, we became very optimistic. I think maybe 10 days out, or 15 days out, became very optimistic for a number of reasons. Well, I said October 22nd, so 17 days out. But for him, it was really, we went upstairs after Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa were in, and a combination of Pennsylvania or Michigan were looking good. And then we went back upstairs to the residence where he finished his speech on his own. And we waited, and he kept saying, stop, congratulating, stop, people are calling, until Pennsylvania came in.
You
So
got to
that was
give credit.
1:36 a.m.
He
but-
sat there with the interns all night.
Yes, he really
He
did.
right
Well,
there
you've
next to
seen the
two
pictures.
interns, sat with there, the 100 people around him. It was hot.
It was nice.
It was so
1:36
hot. I went back to my
a.m.
office.
But the one thing I had told him all along was to stop, because he said, oh, we just had 30,000 people there. How am I losing to her in the state? And that's not directly correlative, we all know. But the fact is, I'd say to him, Hillary Clinton I said, remember the Mitt Romney 47% problem? Yes. I said, she's got a different 47% problem. And I said this on TV publicly many times, so it's out there. But I was always very struck. And when we were making scheduling decisions and investment decisions about the candidates' time and money and paid advertisement and earned media, I was very struck that Secretary Clinton was pretty much mired at 44, 46, 47% in all of these states that President Obama had carried twice with well over 50% of the vote. And the question was, as time marched on, what in the world were these undecided voters going to discover or learn about Hillary Clinton that was going to make them say, that's right? Okay, now she'll somehow make up those 7 points in Michigan or those 8 points in Iowa. And so if we could, even on election night, I would say to him, look, she's at the same 46% she's always been, or she's at the same 47% where we've always had her. And I think that was just a very clarifying moment. I think nationwide she ended up with about 47% or so.
Another question?
I also want to know, when did Hillary Clinton expect to lose?
Well, obviously on election night, we briefed her on what was happening. It was clear we were losing.
So no sooner.
No, I mean, I think we felt, we had a confidence going into election day. Look, I think the other thing, Kellyanne's going to disagree with this, but I think, again, I cannot emphasize enough as we were, because both campaigns were tracking every single night. I do think the undecideds broke against us. I do. And they did. But again, I cannot emphasize enough, based on the data we were seeing every night, that Comey letter had a huge effect.
Well, why did Mrs. Clinton say it didn't? Because she said that very night up at the podium. Was she not telling the truth, Robbie? She said, oh, everybody has already decided what they think about the emails. It won't matter.
And boy, is that what we hoped.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But obviously, I don't think you guys give yourself
She
enough
has a
credit.
universe of her own.
I don't
to
think
coin a phrase.
you give yourself enough credit for the negative campaign you ran, because I hear this heroic story and of him connecting with voters, and I think Corey called it great branding. I think you did a very brilliant job of branding her, less than him. I mean, he limped into this, and God knows he's won, and more credit to all of you. But he has the worst negatives of anybody ever elected. The only other person who had those kind of negatives was Hillary. And I think you did an excellent job of keeping it that way and using media sources that I don't think most of the people in this room follow. They don't watch Alex Jones. They don't read Breitbart every day. They don't know what was on the cover of the National Enquirer every week. They are not watching the fake Facebook stuff or the great dark arts stuff you were pumping out there. There is a world that many people were watching where Hillary Clinton was dying for months of Parkinson's. Rudy would say it on the air occasionally. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. She's, just got days to live. She's going to jail. She's going to jail any minute now. Donald Trump would say it periodically, but there was a very impressive gassing of her that obviously played into things that existed, as I think Kellyanne and David Bossie both talked about. But you do not give yourself credit for how negative it was and how effective it was.
Do you think that's why we won over 200 counties that President Obama won? In other words, he must have had a different message than that. So is that how we turn those counties?
Take the compliment, Kellyanne. Like I'm trying to.
I would if it were one, but
well, it's not. No, it is one, because you also took the FBI that final Comey thing, and I understand that last 2-minute or whatever it was ad was positive, but I also remember
It wasn't positive. It just wasn't about
wasn't
Hillary.
about her.
Right. Okay. It wasn't about
I mean,
her.
just to be
Exactly. It wasn't
honest
positive.
about it.
But I also know that most of what was on the air used the letters FBI. And
I mean, it was out there.
Most of what he ended talking about.
We're still marketers, so if it's out there.
Absolutely. And I'm just saying, it wasn't just that Comey made this announcement. They used it really well. They used it in television. They used it in these channels that you weren't watching. He used it in his speeches. It is nice to think that he ended with an uplifting message, but I'm looking at the message, and the message is Hillary Clinton is guilty. She knows it. The FBI knows it. The people know it. And now it's up to the American people to deliver justice at the ballot box on November 8th. Like, that's a good, strong message. But it is not like uplifting and, let's give that man mandate for, doing wonderful things for the country. I give them credit. We gave you the material to work with. The Comey gave you the material to work with. But do not underestimate the power of that negative campaign. Brad, you haven't had time to talk about some of the Facebook stuff you were doing on the negative side. I'm fascinated to hear all about that because it's so hard for us to track. But
It is
that
very
was
hard. I agree.
Was a very powerful
The media
piece
had no idea unless I told them.
I know. And
That's
more
the beauty of
power to you for
Facebook.
being candid about it. But I think the media didn't understand a lot of what you were doing and a lot of the media channels you used.
I don't take it as a non-compliment. I think the compliment is, I think that we had to get messages out to all kinds of people. I'm not, but I just don't agree with most of it
I
negative.
brought my National Enquirer with me from the last week. Hillary, corrupt, racist, criminal. I mean, the use
It didn't say
of-
crooked, though.
What?
It didn't say
Say
crooked.
No.
So our messaging wasn't working.
I think they got the message. But I think the use of the National Enquirer in the primaries, I think it was a really effective negative campaign, and I don't think you all get the credit for it.
But by the way, just to punctuate the problem, I think, from different perspectives that both camps have with the media, CNN is breaking a story that the president-elect is about to name his Secretary of Defense. One tweet later, Jason Miller, the spokesperson, said he has not made a selection yet, and yet reporters are still retweeting the CNN story that he is naming his Secretary of Defense.
Do you want to tell us if that's correct?
Obviously, if Jason
good
Miller's
problem to
saying
have.
it's not, it's
Okay,
not.
it's a good problem to
But
have.
I mean, but the point is that it just
They want more Twitter followers.
it exists. It just exists, and it keeps on going because somebody said it. Whether somebody, the source says it's not true, it just keeps on going.
See, there is something we totally agree on.
Folks, unfortunately, we have a tight schedule as we have State of the Union with Jake Tapper, Robbie Mook, Kellyanne Conway in the forum, and we have to get everybody mic'd up.